In this world about which the story will go, the life of an elf was long and measured. The elves ate fruit when hungry, but they did not hunt, only honed their bow skills. They communed with spirits and contemplated the truths of the world. Such was the slow life of the elves. Thus, the protagonist lay in a tree and munching an apple dreamed of chowing down on meat. Having 1,000 years of life, a high elf named Isekai'd decided to travel in search of inspiration. The guy was 30 years old when he realized this, and after 120 years he got bored. After swallowing the last piece of apple, Isekai'd noticed the wind spirits in front of him. The protagonist decided that he had had enough of this life as an elf, and it was clearly not for him. He was reborn with memories of his past life. Knowing a world full of cultural products, he realized the lack of stimulation in this world. Knowing no other life, the higher elves loved the forest and lived in it without any worries. The lifespan of the higher elves was more than 1,000 years. After the death of the body, the soul becomes a spirit, shaking the natural world until the end of the world. Isekai'd had behaved like this for over 100 years, but he believed that he was already close to the limit. The boy looked at the sparrow that flew up to him and hinted that he was getting tired of the fruit. The bird immediately flew away from the elf, and Isekai'd decided he was pretty smart. The hero wasn't going to continue living like this for another 100 years, or even until the end of the world, and that was too much. If it did, Isekai'd wanted to see, eat, and experience many things, and after satisfaction become a spirit or something else. The boy cut off his long hair and fixed his new haircut, noticing that it made him feel better. In the deep forest where the elves lived, there was a great sea of tall trees called the plow, and no one ever knew what was beyond the barrier of the elves. Isekai'd prepared some bags and thought that he should prepare well for the journey. There was no one here that he wanted to say goodbye to before leaving, but the hero thought that if there was someone and they were bound by fate, they would meet again. The lad set off, checking his carry-on luggage, his bow and arrow in a woven ivy sack, and his packed food. He also brought with him a stone knife. It had been half a month since the hero had left. He found the world outside the forest amazing. As soon as he stepped outside the barrier, he was attacked by a forest wolf. When he moved along the river, Ace was attacked by monsters and sometimes even had fish bite his legs. However, the guy was satisfied and knew what to do with the claws and fangs of the forest wolf. The big fangs could make a dagger or a knife, and the small fangs could be made into a necklace by putting them on a string. The hero decided that first he should learn from someone how to process and craft. Isekai'd stepped out onto the plain, where a horizon opened up before him that stretched in all directions. The insanely beautiful view enthralled the lad. He ran down the hill thinking that it was an endless world. Isekai'd headed towards the nearest town, and the soldier thought it was his first time in a city of humans. He warned that there would be a fee to enter the city. Entry cost 20 coppers with ID or 1 silver without. The soldier said that, in general, he needed the money to get through. But looking at the uncomprehending Ace, he doubted that the fellow even knew what money was. Of course, the hero knew what it was and understood what it meant, but he didn't have a penny, and the guy hung his head. The soldier looked at the guy sympathetically and asked if he had any acquaintances in town. If so, he could call them to pay and he would pay them back the money later. Isekai'd didn't want to do that, but suggested that they could ask to buy the fangs of a timber wolf. While they were having a conversation with the soldier, a group of people appeared behind them. The girl in the group called out to Ace and asked him to come over for a moment. She grabbed the hand of an uncomprehending elf and pulled him aside. The girl turned around and looked intently at Ace. She asked the guy in a whisper if he was really a high elf. The thing was that to ordinary elves, high elves seemed to be clothed in light. This could not be hidden due to the immortality of the soul. The boy thought that he would definitely not be able to hide such a thing and nodded in agreement. If he was okay with it, the girl would like to know from him what brought a person like him to the city of humans. The hero said that he was bored in the forest, so he decided to see the world, but the girl stared at the guy incredulously. The hero asked to be called Eyes, for that was what they called him in the backwoods. She had the same suspicious look on her face, and apparently she thought he was strange. Her facial expression was constantly changing, and perhaps she had been living in the outside world for too long. Isekai'd realized that elves also changed when they went outside. After thinking for a bit, the girl turned to the guy. She bowed and admitted that it would be impolite to make such an offer to a high elf, but she had some connections, so she would be happy to help him. The hero smiled and thanked her for her help, since that was all he needed. Such a reaction quite surprised the girl. She knelt down and kissed the hero's hand, and Ace felt embarrassed. In his opinion, he should have been the one to shake her hand. Isekai'd certainly appreciated her help, but when they entered the city, he wished he could part ways with them right away. The girl put her hand to her chest and said that a 6-star team called White Lake would guarantee Isekai'd-sama's identity, and they would also pay the entrance fee. The guy in the group explained to Ease that 6 stars was the rank of adventurer. 1 star was for beginners and the highest rank was at 7 stars. There were only a few groups in the country, but they had 6 stars and they were the highest ranked in the Wista court. Apparently, this guy was very pleased with himself and Isa clapped his hands. Meanwhile, the girl had already arranged with the soldier that asked Isa to come over to them. The soldier congratulated the guy and said that he could enter the city whenever he wanted. He also warned that if he caused trouble in the town, the guarantor would be responsible for it. The rules were pretty simple. You couldn't steal, get guns on the street, and so on. If a non-citizen came to the city for a long time, he or she had to pay a stay tax. Isa read the rules and decided he had to be careful with them. If he read everything and was in agreement, he had to sign his or her name on the paper. The soldier read the guy's name and introduced himself by the name of the Rodner from the guardhouse. He clapped the guy on the back and told him to contact him if he had any problems. He opened the doors for the group of guys and welcomed them to the town of Vistacourt. It was the first time the guy had seen a real city and he came to marvel at the sight. While he was looking around enthusiastically, the girl in the group asked if he had any plans about what to do afterward. And if he didn't have any plans, she would recommend that he register as an adventurer to get an ID card. Isa thought about her suggestion, but he had something more important he wanted to do. He wanted to process the materials of the forest wolf, and to do that he needed to get to the forge. The hero asked the boys where the best place to do that was around here. The girl was obviously upset, but said that the best forge in town was the gnome's shop. She also wondered if the hero could sell anything to them, the regular elves. Isa remembered about the gnomes in elven mythology. It was said that the dwarves stole a piece of fire from all of nature and locked it away in a furnace. Mythology aside, elves and dwarves didn't get along, and the girl named Erna was right. The dwarves might just not have sold them anything. However, the hero wanted to see the gnomes anyway, if the guys were okay with it. If Erna didn't like it, the guy would just want to find out where this workshop was located. The girl was shocked that Isa didn't hate gnomes, but the guy admitted that he had never met them before and hating them would be strange. The elves hated metal products and gnomes, because the trees of the forest are scared of the metal products made by the gnomes. The hero could understand if they were still afraid of the axe, but being afraid of the utensils was stupid, so the guy thought they just hated them. Isa remembered that he wanted to go to an inn, but he didn't have any money and asked the girl to buy something from him. The boy held out a fruit to the girl and said that people used to make an elixir of youth from this and it could probably come in handy. The girl was shocked to receive a raft of apua from the hero. The fact was that the elves were very fond of this fruit, and thanks to Aaron it had entered this city. Therefore Eyes would like her to take it. He held out another fruit to her in gratitude and thanked her for helping him. Everyone froze in place looking at the guy, but the hero didn't realize what was wrong with them. Aaron angrily asked not to show those fruits to others so easily, and also said that she would explain first thing tomorrow regarding money and human life. She added that they would only go to the forge after they were done with these matters and decided to make sure that Isa understood her. It seems that the hero had no other choice and was willing to learn many things from Aaron. The next morning, the protagonist reached the forge and said hello to the owners upon entering. But when he went inside, he realized that no one was there and assumed that the blacksmith was busy. Inside, he saw many interesting weapons that caught his attention. While he was admiring different things, the blacksmith came out of the room and apologized for waiting. Wiping his face with sweat, the dwarf said that the guy had pretty good taste, but there were better specimens. But as soon as the hero turned to face the gnome, the man noticed he was an elf and asked what he was doing in his store. He exclaimed that he wasn't selling anything to the damn elves. The guy decided to greet the gnome with a smile and called him the same as the man had called him earlier. Isa looked at the weapons and said that they were very good cookery, but he wasn't here for shopping. Also, he had already chosen the material for his knife and after apologizing, he handed the gnome a souvenir of their acquaintance. By the way, it was a polite way for an apology. The gnome gave the guy a grumpy look and rephrased what he had called him earlier. Besides, he thought that elves were only good for picking out drinks. The man calmed down a bit and let go of Ace's robe. He wanted to know what reason the hero had come to him, and if it was for some silly business, he was definitely ready to nail him. Isa showed the dwarf a fang he had gotten in the woods from a killed wolf and would like to make a knife out of it. Especially the hero wanted this material not to go to waste since he had killed the wolf. The dwarf called the elf a dolt and said that he was mistaken, for it was the fang of a much larger beast called a grand wolf. This work was not for an amateur, and here a couple of tricks cannot do and needed experience. The hero smiled and said that was the reason he had come here, to learn from the best dwarf in town. He couldn't bring any hide or meat with him because there was no knife at hand, only fang and claws. The gnome sighed heavily and said that in that case he could work the fang for him. And if he was that strong, then Isa could earn as an adventurer. The dwarf spoke of being able to forge a weapon for him, but Isa waved his head negatively. The elf said he didn't want to stop adventuring just yet, and he wanted not only a knife, but other items made from fangs and claws. He would like to become a blacksmith for 10 or even 20 years, and he was interested in blacksmithing. With such a statement, the dwarf fell into a stupor. The man grabbed his head and thought that the guy wasn't just a dummy, but a very strange elf. But he considered that let him be better strange than arrogant. The lad was delighted when the dwarf said he would teach him blacksmithing, for it would be a pity if his grand wolf fang went to waste. Whatever a person's path is, even if the other does not understand it, it will always cross someone else's path. Shining with happiness, Isa held out his hand to the dwarf in a gesture of cooperation, and the dwarf threw a suspicious sullen look at the lad. The blacksmith realized that the elf was not going to give up and shook his hand. Later, the girl in the group found out about everything that had happened to Ace and grabbed her head. But she still couldn't understand why Isa herself had to work in the gnome's shop. The hero did not understand what she meant, for if he worked for him, the smith would pay him. Meanwhile, Arena was paying for an inn, and a very luxurious one at that. The guy's drool flowed when he thought of the minced meat stew, bread that is filled with the aroma of wheat and steak with rich flavor. The boy said he couldn't do it now, but one day he would like to be independent and pay back all the money to Arena. The girl was shaken and said that was not the point. The point was that if the smell of iron got on his body, the trees would be frightened, and the spirits didn't like that. She didn't even want to imagine about what would happen to him if eyes left the spirits. But Isa replied that she was wrong about that, and the spirits would not hate her if she smelled of metal. Of course, they didn't like being chopped with an axe, but trees are so weak. There may have been a case where the spirits were angered by pollution caused by mineral poisoning. And when the elves found out about it, they decided that the spirits certainly hate metal and spread the word. But if the hero put a pot of the plant in the forge, he was sure the baby would get along with it. Isa asked the teacher if he could bring the plant here, and the dwarf gave him a silent look. He only sighed heavily, and the lad assumed that by doing so, he was letting him do what he wanted to do. The hero would have loved to tell the girl about the spirits, but while she was here, he wanted her to buy something. He showed her the guns and told her that he recommended these chickens for purchase. Erin thought that it was really a good thing since it was made by a dwarf. Besides, by buying them, she thought that Isa herself would not be angry with her. The guy smiled and said he'd be mad as hell if she cared carelessly about it. But if she used him with care, he was fine with that. Erna thought that Isa saw something she didn't, or rather, he saw something she wasn't even trying to see. The girl politely asked the salesman to sell her this knife. She smiled and promised to take care of it. Watching them from the side, the dwarf thought that this could in no way eliminate the enmity between elves and dwarves. Thus, the hero sold a good quality weapon to an experienced adventurer. That should have been enough to make them happy. Isa waved goodbye to the girl and the Aaron left. Thus passed a year since the hero had settled in this city. A squad of Aaron called White Lake came here to completely upgrade their equipment. The more customers there were, the more staff in the store, and the hero learned how to forge nails. At that time there was a shortage of metal products, which made their lives difficult. The neighbors of the blacksmith shop became their best friends. Isa relayed to the teacher the requests of the locals who asked to be given at least nails, let alone pots or knives. The dwarf noticed the increase in clientele with the elf's arrival and suggested he try to do it himself. In the meantime, he was ready to teach him blacksmithing. Making nails for eyes was fun, and he got more work and a bigger paycheck. But Aaron still paid most of his living expenses. Judging by the value of money she taught him, his living cost about 5,000 yen a night. The girl also presented the lad with her payment for the lesson and for learning a lot about spirits. The hero was reluctant to accept the money, but she insisted on it. In time, Isa complained about this to the soldier Rodner, thus making him laugh to tears. While the guys were sitting at the bar having a drink, Rodner said that earlier she had vouched for him after all. Therefore, she could not leave him alone in all respects. But if the hero wanted to leave the inn, Rodness was willing to find a safe place for him, so Aaron could calm down a bit. The hero thought about meeting Aaron, the gnome teacher, and Rodners. He was insanely happy to have them in his life. Aaron's squad was now off on a long-term errand, and when she returned, the lad decided to have a serious talk with her on the subject. One evening, Martin's girlfriend from the Erna squad burst into the forge. The guy greeted her with a smile, but the girl was agitated about something. With tears in her eyes, she asked the hero for help to stop the mad spirit, and they needed his power. Not understanding anything, the boy looked at the teacher and the gnome let him leave. Martina clutched at the hero's arm and asked him to hurry up. The heroes arrived at the hotel where the girl said that it was quite a long and confusing story, and apparently it was a rather unpleasant affair. Their squad took the order. The request came from the city of Galaret, more than 2 weeks away from here. The request came to their band of the White Lake, or rather to the elf Aaron Dukovitis present. The request was to lift the curse of a mad water spirit that had polluted the river water in the city of Galareth. According to the Aaron, one of the inhabitants had angered the water spirit, and it was not difficult to realize that the people had become ill from drinking the water. Also at the same time, there was a mass die-off of fish in the river while the surrounding vegetation was not weakened. It was indeed impossible for the water spirit to pollute the water in which it dwells. The hero realized that it was not a curse, but a pollution problem. He heard that the town of Galaret was a new town where a mine was found 10 years ago. In other words, the pollution damage caused by the ore poison was blamed on the angry spirit. Guy wondered if Lord Galaret knew what kind of man he was. Martina told him that the Lord was from a new noble family who was enthusiastic about developing the mine and trusted to him by the king. Isa didn't know what they should do, for perhaps the Lord had realized the cause and shifted the blame, or was not aware of the environmental problem at all. Thinking of what happened next brought tears to the girl's eyes. She said that Erin then went to the site and tried her best to calm the angry spirit that wanted to destroy the city, and Kreia stayed behind as a guard just in case. She meanwhile rushed back for help, and Eyes realized everything. Despite the difficult situation, Erna was confidently developing as a spirit witch. In this situation, it could be considered a kind of blessing. After all, Erin could easily accomplish the task if she just did what was wanted of her. If the water environment was destroyed, the spirit would not be able to interfere in this world. But she recognized the problem correctly and worked to solve it. Erin saw the spirit as a friend, not an enemy. Isa was always cooperative, but told Martina that they would need another helper. Dwarves had worked with metals since ancient times, so they knew a great deal about their harmful effects. The hero suggested that he seek help from his gnome teacher. After their story, the blacksmith hesitated and said that he understood what they were talking about. Of course, if the blacksmiths' union investigated, the results would reach the king. Martina and Isa didn't even think that the blacksmith would so easily agree to investigate there, and were greatly surprised by it. Isa suggested just introducing them to someone from the Alliance, and that was it, because without the gnome teacher, the store would be closed for a long time. But the gnome replied that if it was an ordinary blacksmith from the Union who would investigate, the information might not reach the king. But if it was a gnome blacksmith, then the king would have to act. The dwarves had a very strong influence in the kingdom, and many of them were in alliances in this country. But none of the dwarves would listen to a bloody elf except him. The boys looked at each other and laughed for some reason, but the dwarf didn't understand what was so funny about it. What happened next was simple. They, as the ones working here, cared about all of this. The women believed that if the mine in Galareth was closed, metal prices would rise. Even if another mine was discovered, there would be opposition to its development. It was also a big problem for them, and they asked the heroes to be careful along the way. The dwarf bowed to the women who stayed behind to keep an eye on the forge and said to go to the capital first and try to get the alliance up and running. Isa was confident that his gnome teacher would take care of the matter, and they headed for the city of Galareth. The heroes boarded the wagon, and Isa remembered that he was a high elf living in the human world. Therefore, he would do what only a high elf could do. The main characters reached the camp, where they met Kreia's from their team. The guy was warming himself by the fire and looked rather intimidating. With dark circles under his eyes and hollow cheekbones, Kreia's was glad to see the Martin. He thanked the heavens for being here, and apparently he was holding a position here. Farther on, an impenetrable fog enveloped the forest. If any humans stepped there, the fog would begin to condense into water in their windpipes, effectively drowning them. The Martina's trip back and forth had lasted almost a month, and staying here all that time had been torture. Isa smiled and told the guy that they had all done a good job, and as soon as the Aaron returned, they would go somewhere safer. This place was clearly not for humans. The hero said goodbye to the others and headed off to find the Erna. He apologized for being late. Turning around, Erna saw Isa in front of her. Isa noticed that she had traveled quite far in such a short time and was proud to be able to call her an acquaintance. At the sight of the noble Isa, Erin could not hold back her tears. She asked him to go back, but the hero assured her that everything was fine and asked her to leave the rest to him. Plus, she was paying all of his living expenses. He had to work off his money somehow. The girl wiped her tears, and the guy said her teammates were waiting for her so she could go back. At death, a high elf became an immortal spirit, so they were roughly equal to her. An elf like Aaron could only ask the spirit, but she couldn't tell it off in any way. The hero felt that it was about time he got into the game and called out to the one that lived in this beautiful spring. He wished to know what made this spirit so angry. The spirit girl stared angrily at the elf, then told him her story. Long ago, there were people who lived here who deeply revered nature. This reverence also applied to the spring spirit, and they even deified her. One day this land was invaded and the survivors integrated into the new culture, but did not betray their faith. They were strongly opposed to the mining project, so they were driven out. But the spirit could not intervene unless specifically asked to do so. But that tribe did not want to involve the spirit in the dispute. The fish were dying and the water was getting polluted. Because of this, the spirit decided that the invaders should be washed away. It was all for herself, for her favorite people, and for the earth itself. It could not allow the pollution to continue unabated. But then this child appeared before her and she decided everything for herself. The spirit decided that for the sake of this girl, and the world in which she lived, the evil must be completely washed away. Isa saw that their affairs were bad, for the spirit had already made her decision. He understood her feelings, and he wanted to turn the course of events in his direction like the current of water. He told the spirit that he was well aware of her anger, but if she carried out her plan, the weak and righteous people would also be swept away, and she should not have directed that anger at them. The laborers, who worked with only the purest of intentions, did not know the harm their actions were causing. Innocent babies, not yet knowing good and evil, and mothers diligently feeding these babies. This was especially true for the children. The children here now, and the children of her favorite people were virtually indistinguishable. And if she thoughtlessly washed them all away, she would no longer be the spirit they honored. With tears in her eyes, the spirit remembered the people who had thanked her for the blessing from which they had prospered. As for the pollution, Isa's friend was already working to remove it, so the hero wished that the spirit of water would not direct its anger at those who did not deserve it. And thus, in the end, the city of Galarath was saved. Thanks to the gnome teacher, the blacksmith guild was currently working on a solution to the problem at the mine. Any work on this mine was now only possible after their approval. The true cause of the incident became public knowledge and White Lake successfully completed the task. The lord of the town was held accountable for the problems with the mine and relieved of his position, and the exile of the indigenous people was revoked. The hero hoped they would go back and live here without fear. Some time later, the former lord committed suicide in his own bathtub, and the king who appointed him also drowned himself in his bathtub 3 days later. The deposed lord bore a grudge against the king, and it was rumored that the lord had given his life to put a curse on him. But the truth will remain somewhere in the dark depths. 3 years after Isa began to learn blacksmithing, he was able to start by working on weapons and armor, and he happened to meet a fellow. A very young-looking fellow apologized and said he would like to buy this. He wondered if they had armor that would go well with this club, and could spend a bag of coins on it. The guy was attracted to the mace that Ace had made, and if the guy can use it with one hand, Eyes thought a shield would be a good choice. Leather boots would also help him keep his stability. The elf thought with a smile on his face that he was a pretty tough kid and would make a fine adventurer. If things went well, he would make money and come back for even better gear. And if that happens, he can choose his job again. And the hero would like that to be the case. Now he felt motivated. The boy named Astor said goodbye to the hero, who was looking forward to seeing them again. Every day the boy labored in the blacksmith shop, and after a while he made a bow that hit the target accurately. And when his hair grew back, Aaron was happy to cut it. The hero's work was varied, and he also repaired armor that was attacked by huge monsters. He even had the chance to meet a small infant. So 10 years passed since Isa began to learn blacksmithing. At some point, the teacher told the boy some news that shocked him. As it turned out, the gnome teacher had gotten married, and the blacksmith reminded him that he had a bride. And thus the hero was called to take over the family business. Isa asked how old the gnome was, and the blacksmith was surprised that he only asked that now. He was 90 years old, but that was about as old for a dwarf as 25, 30 years old for a human. It was hard for the hero to imagine such a thing, and he found it all rather interesting. The gnome hit the guy on the head and said that someday he would also have to think about his future. The hero grabbed his head and decided that it would take some time anyway. The teacher has taken in many students in the last decade. Many of them are now skilled enough to start their own businesses. So even if the gnome teacher leaves, his apprentices will make up for the loss to the blacksmithing world. Meanwhile, the seeds that Isa spent so much time nurturing have grown into a marvelous tree. Apparently, to begin learning from the gnome now, one had to become an experienced blacksmith. The first time the hero saw him, he didn't know this and acted rather recklessly. An absolute beginner couldn't learn from a gnome, and Eyes thought he was being somewhat arrogant. Still, the gnome teacher then took him on as a student, and the lad thought they had a real connection. The lad decided to ask the gnome who the lucky girl was, and the gnome remarked that it was pretty bold to ask that when he was holding a cleaver. The number of blacksmiths wasn't the only thing that had changed in the last decade. For example, the band White Lake rose to the top, becoming a 7-star team, and 3 years ago they broke up. The warrior Kreyas and the Martin priestess eventually got married. They retired at the peak of their careers and hoped to train the next generation of adventurers. And the hero would say it was the right decision. Erna left the city in search of new comrades. In parting, she said that her adventures were just beginning and she wasn't done yet. She said goodbye to the hero with a smile, but also decided to say a few things goodbye. The girl loaded him with so many warnings that he felt like she was his mother. She said that he was completely independent, but there were still quite a few people in this town. There were plenty of things to remember and pay attention to, as well as things to watch out for. Erna was angry, thinking that the guy wasn't listening to her, and ordered her to look her in the eye when she talked to him. The very first person the hero met in this town was a soldier, Rodner. During this time he rose through the ranks, becoming a captain of the guard. One day he visited the hero and suggested that they have a drink together. Even after all this time, they would often gather with him at the local cafeteria for a drink or two. One day Mr. Eyes was visited by the same young lad Astor, who eventually became a great warrior. He proudly told Blacksmith Eyes that he had raised his rank to 5 stars and had a good chance of reaching the White Lake level. After all, he was undoubtedly an excellent adventurer, and the elf congratulated the lad on his promotion. Quite a lot had happened to the lad in the past 10 years, and the life he had lived before that for 150 years was nothing compared to this, and he was sure of it. The teacher asked the hero what he would do when he returned to the Gnome Kingdom. The boy thought for a moment and suggested that he would learn how to wield a sword and use magic. He wanted to look for places in the capital where this could be taught, and with enough money. The dwarf sat down on a stool and thought that his spiritual stuff, a kind of magic already. The gnome smiled slightly and said that the guy was inscrutable as usual. Deciding to leave that topic, he told Ace that he could do whatever he wanted. The lad was surprised when the dwarf addressed him by name. The blacksmith lowered his eyes and said that the one was undoubtedly his best student, and he would always be his friend. Isa couldn't stand it and laughed, for that was completely unlike him, and the dwarf smirked. Wiping tears from laughter, the hero said that a high elf like him would hardly ever be able to visit the dwarf kingdom, so Oswald was just his teacher. Oswald smiled and said that he was still his friend whom he would never forget. As soon as the gnome shook the guy's hand, his tears of laughter turned to real tears, and the gnome asked him to stop, especially since he was the one who wasn't like himself right now. The blacksmith would say that was his forte, getting into whatever adventures he wanted to. He decided to cheer up Ace and punched him in the stomach. The dwarf then asked to be given 50 years, and after that time he offered to come to the dwarf kingdom. The gnome smiled and reminded him that he was the best blacksmith in the land, so he would surely become king. And when he sits on the throne, he will make it so that the elves can come to them whenever they want. And when the Aesa do visit them, he will proudly raise his head and introduce himself as his apprentice. For the dwarves, blacksmithing was everything, and with this skill they could reach any heights and even become king. In such a case, the hero could not afford to relax and decided to keep improving, even if it was just one step. The teacher left the forge to one of his students, and Aesa borrowed it briefly to make a knife. The teacher gave him an official blacksmith's license. He literally had to pry it out of the hands of the guild blacksmiths. They were shocked that an elf was getting the license, and the dwarf did his best to beat it out. Eventually, Ace's luggage was replenished with the license and a knife made of wolf's fang. One day Aesa went out of town and ate a fruit before traveling. By wagon it took about 10 days to reach the capital city, and if one walked, even longer. But since he had such a chance, he would still walk and reminisce about the past 10 years. Thus, the hero traveled to the capital on foot. Eventually Eyes reached the capital of the kingdom of Ludria, Vorfil, and was impressed. Before entering the city, people recognized the elf blacksmith living in human cities and assumed he was here to study swords and sorcery. That being said, he also had an elevated rank. The registrar apologized for the remark, but the hero seemed a bit eccentric. Thus Aesa found himself in the capital, where the first thing he did was buy some food. The royal capital, called Werfil, was right in the middle of the kingdom of Ludria. It's obvious, but it's busier and nicer than Vistacorta. It also has many schools and training swordsmen. There were 3 main schools of swordsmanship here, and altogether they were known as the 3 disciplines. The royal style was called Ludrian. It was a balanced style with sword and shield that was quite common. Many soldiers and nobles used it, so the hero didn't see it as a big deal. There was also a two-handed sword style. The hero remembered this style. Thanks to it, it was possible to ram the enemy with his body and kick him. Kreyas had used something similar before. And the last was the Grenda style, which focused on absolute defense. It suppressed the opponent, and the hero felt that such a style was definitely not suitable for him. The guy remembered hearing about another style, but thought it had just disappeared due to lack of students. While the hero was thinking about which one would suit him better, he noticed street performers on the streets. His attention was caught by a dark-haired girl who was using a sword in a performance. With one swing, she was able to cut in half an apple that lay on the table in front of her. It seemed impossible to ace. He couldn't say that this blade was blunt, but still he didn't understand how she was able to make such a clean cut. He saw it with his own eyes and could not doubt the beauty of her swing. The hero decided to approach the girl who was cleaning her blade. The hero placed a silver coin on the table to the surprised girl and exclaimed that her technique had stolen his heart, so he wished she would take him as an apprentice. The girl thought she misunderstood him and asked a question. Isa bowed and said he would pay her tuition and would do any work. The hero begged and pleaded with her over and over again. The girl was embarrassed, not knowing what to answer him, and the guy admitted that he didn't know about the style that she practiced. However, he didn't care and wanted to master it. The girl understood him and said she would take him to her dojo, but she was sure the guy would change his mind once he saw everything with his own eyes. The guy was shocked when the girl led him to a building in ruins. The thing is, one of the 4 disciplines was taught here, and it was a dojo called Yasogi Ryu. But the head of the school was defeated by a Lodran. They used a fake sword, but he was hit so hard that he died. The rest of the students wanted revenge, but there was much debate about who should be the next head. Their intended revenge was suppressed and the dojo never recovered. She and her mother were ignored and left them alone, starting an internal war, thus marking the end of what Yasogi Ryu once was. The hero didn't understand what she meant, and the girl said that now this style was for spectacle but not for combat. Her style was all she had left of her father's teachings, which she had developed in her own way under his supervision. But learning their style might have attracted unnecessary attention from the Lodran school, so the girl suggested that Isu go on her own way. But the guy stopped her and said it was fine. Besides, the style she showed was exactly what he wanted to learn. Of course, he didn't know how strong the Lodran students were, but he wasn't scared. He doubted that many were at the level of Kreyas. Before they began, however, the hero would ask that her sword be given to him to work on for a week. After all, he wouldn't be able to keep up with her style in this state. The girl looked at the guy in surprise and asked who he was. The guy replied that he was a high elf of eyes who specialized in archery and spirit summoning, and he was also a licensed blacksmith of advanced rank. If she was okay with it, he would like to be her first student of the Reborn Yasogi Ryu school. While they were talking, a woman appeared behind them and noticed that they had guests. Tina told the woman that as of today, Isa was officially working for them and would also be staying in the guest room. Isa and the woman said hello and then looked at Kina in surprise. Very quickly things became very tense. Tina's mother was suffering from a breast condition, so the hero went to the forest and gathered medicinal herbs for her. He also treated her to the fruit of Apua, which revitalized the body. Tina performed in the street for the sake of paying for her mother's medicine. The hero was somewhat of an expert in this field, so he decided to save her time and money. He created a medicine that was surprisingly very tasty. Isa also started going to the blacksmith's guild in his spare time, where everyone was surprised by the elf and his advanced rank. He worked on Kina's sword as his own, so he started taking orders here. The guy felt that he had to make some connections here, because it could be useful to him in the future. He socialized with people on the way back to the dojo. He also spread the rumor that the elf had joined the Yasogi Ryu school. This would surely attract those disgusted with the idea of reviving the 4th discipline like moths to a flame. Also, if anything were to happen to either of these two, it would disrupt his training. Regardless of whether it was his responsibility to protect them, he was just doing what he wanted to do. But now the hero had no time to study sorcery, and he could put it off for another couple decades. In the meantime, Kreyas replied to his letter. Isa wished they weren't being paid too much attention to by the Lordland students, so he wanted the former 7-star member of the team to spook them. The guy politely asked him to do so. In the letter, Kreyas asked him to leave all developments with the Lordran school to him. If anything were to happen, he wanted to know about it before destroying the Lordran building. Kreyas wrote that he would send the letter right away, and he would be in Warfel soon anyway, so they could talk to him in person, and offered to meet. Ace didn't realize who he thought he was and decided he wouldn't go that far. He thought the friction with the Yasogi school started when he was on the adventure, but he was still a student at the Lodran school. Isa imagined how Kina and her mother would react when Kryos came here and thought about the relationship between people. They were very fragile and very hard to manage. Guy understood why elves would choose to be hermits and knew he could be somewhat overbearing. But the hero wanted to socialize with humans. After all, he had never seen anything cuter than Akina's smile. After that, his training finally started, but it was very simple. It all came down to practicing swings, and the guy copied all the movements that the Kina did. Kina hadn't trained anyone before, so this was the only normal option for her. It wasn't something that needed to be taught to beginners, but it was fine for Ace. All this training reminded him of his blacksmithing. He made adjustments in various places until he was done. Slowly, step by step, he had nothing but time. After 6 months of his training, the Kreyas came to them. He stopped at the Ladrin school before coming to the dojo and listened to the Kina. Since Kreyas was an acquaintance of Ai's, the boy decided to stand behind him. And honestly, to him, he was a really cool adventurer. The girls were shocked when Kreyas bowed down to them and apologized for their comrades, who were deeply sorry for all the trouble they had provided them. It seemed that they saw in Kreyas a noble warrior, and it ended with him staying the night in the guest room. The woman thought it would be wonderful, and the Kina asked him to tell her about fencing. One day the girl called out to Sir Kreyas and had something she wanted to ask him. Kina wanted to have one round with him and the guy gladly agreed. In the end, it turned out that Kina was completely helpless against him and accepted her defeat, which upset her mother. The only thing Kreyas could say was that her level of swordsmanship was very low, and the real world was a practical experience for her. That was something he had in abundance, but it wasn't what everyone needed. The hero thought that there was nothing special about it, slowly and steadily moving towards his goal. If Kina's mastery of the sword was imperfect, then his would be the same. Kina advised that for 3 or 2 years to be her adventurer. He meant that the strongest man he knew would be by her side the whole time and pointed his finger at Ai's. During the training session, the girl told Ai's that he was doing favor after favor for her. Her sword, her mother, and Sir Kreyas. However, if they would forgive her, she would ask him to do one more favor, for she was going to be an adventurer. Kina bowed to Ai's and asked him to watch over her mother during her absence. As far as the hero understood the path of the sword, each person has it different. That said, he had 2 conditions. First, he wanted to make her a set of armor before she left. And 2, she had to use his house in Isekai'd as headquarters. Kina was shocked that the hero turned out to have a house. She figured it out, and the hero thought she was a naive little girl. And if Kina lived in his house, his acquaintances would be able to keep an eye on her. She would have various neighbors and colleagues with her, also the church priestess of Isekai'd and the swordsmanship instructor of the Adventurers Guild. Guy hoped that she would still be able to train and steel herself, even while adjusting to this new life. Ace wondered if Irina felt that way. The girl shook the hero's hand and promised that she would become a swordswoman worthy of being his master. All she wanted was for him to wait for her for a while, and Isa agreed. 3 years after Kina left, the hero completely renovated the dojo, practicing swinging alone. He vowed to protect the Kina's mother, so he never left her. He had a blacksmith shop that he built next to the dojo. Kina left when the dojo was being demolished, so she never saw it finished. The hero's blacksmithing skills have improved markedly since he began his training. He even asked permission to enter a competition to present his work to the king. Last year he placed 3rd, and this year he placed 2nd. The only ones who beat him were the dwarves. Maybe that's why he was bothered by nobles and bullies. They made orders for swords, invitations to their properties, and banquets and such. But once they realized he was much more stubborn than a dwarf, they left him alone. Isa also thanked his spirits for helping to drive them away. A woman called out to the hero and said that a letter had arrived from the Kina. The boy hastened to read it. Every 2 or 3 months letters came from the Kina with stories of how she ate meat with her hands or how the adventurer accompanying her professed his love for her. The woman wondered what was in the letter this time, and the boy assumed that she had raised her rank again. In the first year she had gotten 4 stars, and in the second year she had already gotten 5 stars. She was progressing very fast for someone who acts alone. The hero worried that she had done too much in such a small amount of time, but knew that Kreyas was keeping an eye on her. Her skills were now developing very quickly due to the experience she had gained from her adventures. Isa was even a little jealous of this, that Kreyas would see it first. At that moment, Kreyas sneezed a lot. After reading the letter, the woman was surprised and Ace was curious. The girl managed to get 6 stars, but that wasn't all. She reported that she would be coming home very soon, and her mother wiped the tears under her eyes. They would be able to see her after 3 years, and the hero thought about his master coming back. While Isa was doing his work and waiting for his master to return, he was called out. The woman told the tired boy that dinner was ready. Since they received this letter, some things have changed. The woman was excited that her daughter would be coming home soon, so she prepared a huge amount of food every day. As usual, before eating, the boy decided to pray and wish her a pleasant appetite. He just couldn't let it all go to waste, so he ate every last drop. Isekai'd desperately hoped that Kina would return home as soon as possible. Or rather, that's what not only he thought, but also his stomach. While the hero was eating rice, he noticed the spirit at the entrance, after which he asked for forgiveness and ran out somewhere. The hero looked silently at the entrance as if waiting for someone. Indeed, after a couple of moments, a female silhouette appeared on the threshold and Isekai'd smiled. The girl immediately swung her sword at the hero, who set up his sword to block the blow. At that moment, he could say one thing with certainty. Those 3 years had not gone to waste, and Isekai'd stared at the blade of his sword, which was broken from a single blow. In those 3 short years, it blossomed into a beautiful, breathtaking flower, and Isekai'd saluted the master. But another surprise awaited the hero. Another figure appeared on the doorstep and told him that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The boy smiled at Irina, who lowered her head at the sight of Ace. Apparently, she needed his help. Those words drove the girl red and embarrassed. The guy turned out to be right. It had been some time, and today she wanted to ask Sir Ace for help. Reyes introduced her to Kina so she could bring her to him. Kina meanwhile noticed that they had a new dojo. On behalf of the captive elves, the girl asked Eyes for help. Her story went something like this. A handful of Ludrian nobles captured and enslaved the elves, presumably for bragging rights. It was hard for the hero to believe that a human could capture elves so easily. But the only elves he knew were the unfortunate ones who worked as adventurers, or maybe the ones who lived deep in the forest. The ordinary elves who lived outside the great sea of trees were not accustomed to fighting because of their nature. Being able to communicate with spirits is one thing, but doing so in battle is quite another. So it is unlikely that humans could capture elves by military force alone. In short, they were nobles who raided elven settlements and territories with their personal armies. Elven settlements were very well hidden, and most humans didn't even notice them. Captured elves were blinded and regularly drugged to disorient their senses so they could not create a connection with spirits. And without that connection, they could only rely on humans to fill their emptiness. They were treated like animals. The elves were not such a docile people, but they are quite attractive. Eyes personally had no idea why everyone wanted a slave, but he could understand why elves were so prized. Some of those responsible were some of the most important nobles in the country. They had the entire eastern region under their rule. The royal government was surely aware of it, but they never intervened. The girl was sure that they regarded the punishment of key figures in the country as no small matter. The secret ownership of slaves by elves was becoming an increasingly popular status symbol among the nobility. In fact, they could even make elf slavery legal in short order, and if they just covertly rescued captured elves, it wouldn't do them any good. The nobles who started this should have been exposed and punished, and the kingdom should apologize for everything. Thus, Eren was not the only one who needed his help and strength. Humans could forget the pain they experienced as a generation passes. Therefore, in order for the elves not to experience such a thing again, it was necessary to save them. The hero said that the pain had to be carved out in the kingdom itself. Elven anger must be expressed as clearly as possible, so Isekai'd would make sure to move the necessary mountains. Erna said she would rescue the captured elves while he was at it, and if all went well, she could convince all the elves in the country to leave the forest and move elsewhere. The elves lived in the forests where the influence of nature is very strong, and if they leave there, the area will be overrun by out-of-control monsters, and eventually the monsters would fill the forest and break out of it. That was why the elves refused to part with the forests they loved so much. Guy said he could convince them to move if things got that bad. Eren fell to her knees and said she was sorry. The hero understood Irina perfectly and asked her to raise her head. He said that if it came to this, he could no longer live in this country. The girl felt sorry that it would affect all the elves, including him, but the boy thought that it was not her fault at all. Tina asked him to stop and reminded him that she still hadn't taught him anything. He became her apprentice, besides curing her mother's ailment, and she still had to thank him for those 3 years. Tina cried, saying that she had done nothing for him even up to that time. She lowered her head and cried, but the guy smiled and told the master that she hadn't. Her earlier blow still burned in his eyes clear as day. She had already given him another reference point so that he could continue to follow her example. The hero asked not to say that she failed to teach him anything or that she did nothing for him. Isa felt that she had done much more for him than he had done for her, and if that wasn't enough for her, he would want her to continue on her path, and also to pass it on to her students or her child, if she had one. And then even if it took decades, even if she was no longer with them, he would still learn from the one who inherited her blade. While they were talking, Irina was still sitting towards them with her head down. She didn't just apologize to him, she also apologized to Kina. She did not tell Kina her intentions. Kina took the hero's hand and vowed to raise her sword even higher and pass it on to her successor. But the girl reminded him that she was still his master, so she asked him to return to her while she was still alive. Isa let go of her hand and smiled. He bowed before her, her blade still burning in his eyes and her words imprinted in his heart. The guy looked at the smiling girl and decided that he was a pretty happy man. He headed to the heart of the eastern Ludria, inside the fruitful forest located in the Marquis lands. It had once contained an elven settlement that had been destroyed by the Marquis personal army. In the end, the preparation of everything took half a year. Isa deeply regretted all the elves who had to endure slavery during that time. But when they left, it would be necessary to rescue all of them at once. If they didn't, anything they left behind would become evidence and could be erased later. Organizing the elven emigration and searching for all the enslaved elves. They couldn't do anything rash unless everything was prepared in advance. Looking at the arrow in the nearest tree, the hero thought over and over how he should attack the noble's territory. He thought about asking the water spirit for help, but that wouldn't work and there would be too much damage. The hero also wanted to ask the spirits of fire and wind to create a flaming tornado right on the territory of the nobles. But a blazing tornado would take too many lives and also wouldn't work. This would lead to a full-scale conflict between humans and elves. Ace needed the spectacle to be as grandiose as possible while minimizing damage. He appealed to the great spirits that lived on and supported the land to assist him. Kneeling before the multitude of spirits, the hero's body glowed. He needed to visualize and focus clearly on the territory of the nobles to the east. He visualized a slight vertical concussion, a slight horizontal sway, and the rumbling of the earth. In the experience of a hero from the past, these tremors would not cause serious damage, but for people who had never experienced something like this, it would be terrifying. It will not affect the noble, but it will affect the honest, righteous, and weak people. Perhaps the people's horror will turn into rage, and rage at the nobles who are responsible for this. Rage at the country that allowed it to happen. But no matter what, Eyes was the one who pulled the trigger. Using the push as a signal, the adventurer elves would go to rescue their captured comrades, and afterward they would begin a mass emigration from the forests. Their number will be around 8,000. Soon the forests will be flooded with monsters and the country will most likely make a formal apology. Only when this apology goes down in history, then they will be assured that such a tragedy will not happen again. Irina would be the main person to negotiate with, as she was a high-ranking adventurer and Ludria would be careful with her. But there was another problem, for if any of the rescued elves had children, the tragedy would continue. Half-elves could not communicate so well with spirits because of their mixed blood and their life expectancy, and growth rates are also different. They were hated for the disasters they brought and brought back to Earth as soon as they were born. Isa did his best to explain that this custom made no sense, but he wasn't sure if any of them were willing to understand it. The boy thought that maybe he would take care of some of the half-elves himself. Either way, he couldn't stay in this country any longer. It had completely slipped his mind, but he never bothered to study magic here. The guy warmed his hands and thought about where he should head next. The hero looked at the blade. The cold glow of his sword helped him calm his turbulent thoughts a bit. This is what he had to show for his time spent in the Ludrium. The choice he had made had its perks and its price. Just for a moment, he allowed himself to stop thinking and slowly swing his sword. The main character was thrilled when he saw the sea for the first time and jumped for joy as high as he could. South of the kingdom of Ludria was Poloja, and further south, the lad reached the Republic of Villastrica, which was on the coast itself. It's not a very large country, but very successful in maritime trade. It is governed by an elected parliament composed of nobles. On its border there are frequent skirmishes with the Poloja, who wanted to gain access to the sea. And Ludria would send food to support Pavloja, so they became another country with misunderstandings with Villastrica. The hero noticed that it was quite hot and the sun was shining scorching. It was said that Ludria was much richer than Poloja. The thought that someone might struggle to obtain something as basic as drinking water had never occurred to him in Ludria. He made sure to pray for the good fortune of this young girl who shared her water with him and for the people of her village. This was his small promise. And now that he had overcome all these difficulties to get here, many things happened to him. They tried to find out from the hero his name, age, and where he came from. They also cared about the purpose of the visit and how long he would be here. A lot of things happened to Ace in Ludria. He just wanted to go somewhere where he could live in peace and see something. but one of his main goals was to eat seafood, and he asked the guards about good restaurants. The soldier told the man that he was definitely not a spy. Besides, the guy was too conspicuous, and they continued their conversation. Turning to the hero, they apologized to the elf-san. The thing was that they had a few problems with the northerners, so they needed to check everyone staying. They welcomed him to the city of Soritu. Here he could find any food he wanted. Plus, they wrote him the name of some of the establishments. The hero wanted to find some sailor and buy fresh fish. He got to the establishment he wanted and assumed it was here. As soon as the hero went inside, he saw a bunch of visitors that were making noise in the establishment, talking among themselves. The hero apologized and asked for permission to sit in an empty seat. As soon as the waitress saw him, she was delighted and surprised. She was shocked that an elf had visited their tavern, and that was a real rarity. The girl greeted him and asked him to take a seat. She wanted to hear his wishes. The lad said he would like to try their best raw and grilled fish, as well as 6 large fried clams and any appropriate drink to go with it. The girl smiled and said it was a large order, but from the looks of it she wouldn't have said the hero was such a glutton. She walked over to another customer and said that if he needed something, then let him ask for it with his tongue. The guy smiled and noticed that this girl was not one of the timid ones. Later, she apologized for the wait and served the guy some dishes. In front of him was a salad with pink fish and truffle oil and 6 fried clams. The mere sight of the food made the hero drool, and he decided to try the clams first. After trying them better, his elf ears twitched with pleasure. It was very tasty, after which he washed it all down with a drink and said it was much better that way. Isa looked at the waitress, who smiled at him. They smiled at each other as she carried the hero his next fish dish. But suddenly there was a rumble and shouts of people swearing. During the conflict, one of the men got tired of repeating the same thing and punched his interlocutor in the face. The guy was thrown back and ran right into the waitress. The protagonist got there in time and backed up the girl from falling, but his fish in the meantime flew to the floor. The waitress along with Ace looked at the cracked plate of fish with horror. The man who hit the guy said that these boars only understand such language and was pleased with himself. The hero went into a rage and told him that he had killed his fish. The enraged hero slapped the offender in the face and ordered him to apologize to her. While the hit guy was trying to figure out what was wrong, the hero ordered him to apologize to this innocent fish, and a fight broke out between them. While they were attacking each other, people were asking for them to stop. Later, the cook took an involuntary glance at the 2 boys who knelt down before him and apologized sincerely. The waitress tried to stand up for the elf lord who was trying to protect her, but the cook ordered the Karina to shut up. The guy who fought with the elf told the Grant that he ruined the elf's day, so it was his fault. The cook named Grant said it was undoubtedly Dree's fault. He didn't realize how much more trouble the guy was going to give them. He had to restrain himself with the last of his strength to keep from knocking normal behavior into him. The guy almost sobbed and said it was all the beginning of a Laret, because he said it wasn't food here, it was garbage. In that case, the hero apologized to him, for he thought it was possible to fight for good food, and he should not have been angry with him. Driz smiled and told the guy that they were now speaking the same language, but he still ruined his lunch and deserved a couple of slaps. Driz asked how long the hero was here for and offered to catch a whole fish for him. Cook Grant was certainly glad they had made up, but suggested they look around. He asked to see the chairs they had broken, and said that if they would pay for them, so be it, he would forgive them for the day. Also, the cook said that if they were going to catch fish, they could bring it to him so he could cook it. In this way, Isa met 3 people at once: a waitress named Karina, a fisherman named Driz, and the tavern owner Grant. His enthusiasm reminded him of his dwarven teacher in some ways, and that's how the hero found himself at the center of the town's events. Something still bothered Ace, and he thought of the man who had been beaten by Drist. He was so rude that he dared to insult the owner's food right in the tavern. But it was strange that such an insolent man would give up so quickly. With these thoughts, the guy made himself a compress on his injured spots and crouched down in pain. Isa removed the towel from his arm and examined the wounds on it. Driz said that he worked for a trading company, and the hero decided that he should be more careful, for if this continued, the wounds could lower his blacksmithing and dueling skills, and that would be unfair to both of them, to Oswald and Kiha. Surely now a dwarven teacher would be telling him that he wasn't practicing enough. The hero recalled his teachers, then crawled into bed and said he had to get up early tomorrow. The next morning, the hero was in a hurry and wished that Drizzt would catch him something. While he was running late, the guy ran up to the pier where he noticed a lot of people and some noise. All the people looked at the rude guy who was trying to leave and asked him to leave the place as he had nothing to do here. Isa hoped they weren't doing too bad and asked Drizzt if everything was okay. He wanted to take advantage of his suggestion from yesterday, but suddenly someone put a hand on the guy's shoulder. The man behind him told the elf that it was none of his business, but at that moment suddenly a jet of water poured on him and he stepped away from the hero. The guy asked not to touch him, because he wanted to talk to Grizz and assured him that it would be worse for him if he touched him again. In his mind, Isa decided that the sea spirits here were more warlike than the others. He hadn't even said anything to them yet and suggested that he wouldn't write them so much. The aggrieved brute exclaimed that it was all because of them, and they started it all. He did not understand how these scoundrels had thought of going against him. Grizz and Ace stared in surprise at the guy who was blaming them for all his problems. Yesterday he had purposely provoked Grizz so that there would be an excuse and offered to take them down. The hero decided he was too hungry for such a thing and dodged an attack from one of the humans. Immediately several guys tried to grab them, but the hero used the power of the spirits, which threw them into the water. Grizz took a surprised look at Ace and recognized that he was pretty strong. In that case, he didn't understand why the guy let himself get beaten yesterday, since he could have just taken him down if he wanted to. But the guy said he didn't need the spirits in a one-on-one fight. Besides, Drizzt would hardly make his friends attack one-on-one, and Drizzt grinned. He clapped the guy on the back and thought he could fish out something else for him and offered to start right away. Besides, he was willing to listen to his every wish. Of course, the god of the seas was fickle, but Isa was willing to do his best. As a result, after a while, everyone watched with delight as the guy ate the seafood dishes. They had a wonderful texture and a drink to die for. They managed to catch and cook boiled octopus. The tavern owner thought he could make a lot of things out of octopus if he experimented, as well as squid. By asking around at the inn and the market, Isa learned about everything that was going on here. In this town, traders came and went in huge ships, while the fishermen used smaller vessels. Because of this, they had serious disputes over the use of the wharf. The fishermen and traders were supported by various members of noble families. These included the Pacelli family, who had been in the fishing business for many years. The Tritran family controlled many trading companies, including the Lorette Company. The Tritran family tried to increase the number of their outlets here, and these two families joined together to improve the town. New people began to come to the town buying things and food. The more was sold, the more money the fishermen had. But even these relationships began to deteriorate. The merchant ships had deep bottoms and needed a deeper harbor. They needed a wider harbor to fit the maximum number of fishermen's ships. The fishermen's ships were small and could be sailed up to the beach itself. They had high sails, and the harbor needed to be even bigger and had to be set up by the beach. The hero didn't know if this was a common problem for coastal towns, but it seemed to be the main conflict of this town. Meanwhile, the cook had prepared another experimental dish and offered Ace a taste of it. A Drizzt came into the tavern and said that he had brought another octopus. Drizzt was something of a leader among the young fishermen, so they wanted to make a show of taunting him. Lorette apparently wanted to humiliate the fishermen in this way, but it became difficult. Drizzt thought the guy had already eaten an octopus, but the hero said it was a decapod. The problem was that even if the bullying was a little horrifying, Isa couldn't say there was anyone who was completely and irrevocably evil. Drizzt hoped the hero was at least munching on a boiled octopus. The fishermen and merchants were closely related, but there was no solution for this problem. Lorette sent the hero a letter of apology and said they would meet tomorrow. It was his 4th day in town. The hero heard that he was a pretty slippery man and would do anything for his own gain, so he ignored his letter. Hero arrived at the coast where he was surrounded by armed local boys. It seemed to him that the guy wanted to apologize to him, but apparently they had no intention of doing so. Isa appealed to the spirits of the land and grabbed the guys with sand. The attackers couldn't figure out what was wrong, since they couldn't move. Asa had a few moments to break all the swords in the guy's hands. The whole group was terrified and decided to run away, but Ace asked the spirits of the earth for one more request. Abruptly, all those fleeing with screams fell into the sand, and the hero smiled at this. He grabbed 10 people and they needed help to get out. They didn't really need to bring a whole company after him. And when the soldiers realized all of this, they found that Lorette was bullying the fishermen. But on top of that, they were also engaging in fraud. To be more succinct, Lorette would have to answer for all his crimes. The trading company tried to kill the traveler, but lost, so he immediately became a serious problem for the Tretran family as well, even though all the town's problems were not solved. But still, while the hero was walking through the town, he saw a small gecko on the ground and decided that he would carry it to safety. both families allowed their men to quarrel. The tug of war between their divergent interests is a way to ease the pressure before the situation boils over, and in the end nothing changed, as if everything was being done clearly according to a script. Ace felt like someone was just using him. The hero continued to enjoy the food and drink at the Grant's Tavern until a month later he was completely full of seafood. On his last night here, he ordered dried salted titmouse. Karina noticed that apparently the hero liked it. They had more and more people ordering it and more octopus. The tavern was constantly noisy and Karina smiled as she said that they had never had so many people. The guy advised them to hire new employees and thought that Grand would keep adding new dishes to the menu that way, so they could expect even more people. Karina assumed that the hero was always busy, and the guy said he would be leaving soon, so he would definitely lessen her workload. The whole time staying in this town, the hero felt someone's gaze on him. Even when they dealt with the Lorette, this gaze didn't go anywhere, which meant that these two noble families hired someone to keep an eye on him. But it was actually Karina who was watching him, and it seemed as if she had a network of spies all over the city. The guy didn't know if the Grant would do anything about it, but he was sure that Karina would deal with Lorette. The girl smiled at the guy and offered him something to eat. Also, if he finished everything, she would have less work to do. His feathery impression of Karina was absolutely correct. The girl confessed that all three of them would miss him, and the hero promised to visit them sometimes. Isa said he was leaving tomorrow morning for the northeast to the land of magic. The girl assumed it was that little country in the east, and the hero said it was. In that case, the girl waved and said they would see each other and suggested that next time they take a grocery store tour. As they said goodbye, they clapped each other's hands with a smile. The hero believed that this city would remain as ever evolving but unchanging for the time being. He hoped that they would miss him. The next destination of the protagonist was the country of Magic 1. It is one of the small states that make up part of the Eastern United Union. The entire region was originally called the Isekai'd Empire, thus it became a region of countries and cities of states. It all started with an inheritance dispute, and afterward, the country existed as if on bones. Eventually, the people said they would run the state on their own. And of course the cities of the state were not particularly harmonious with each other. Still, like all these tiny countries, they avoided being swallowed up by larger powers. The Isekai'd alliance was coming together to fight the introduction of outsiders to them. And also besides the alliance, they also had additional conditions, which was concerning the country of Magic 1. Odin was created as a place to study magic and to train strong mages who can single-handedly change the course of war. It is completely independent, so no city in the state could take it over. One of the hero's goals was to learn sorcery, and he would have a much better chance of finding an excellent teacher in the land of magic alone. And even if he doesn't meet anyone like that there, a regular trip through the country will help him quench his curiosity. While Isa was walking along the road, a carriage moved along the same path. An old man stopped and offered the lad a ride, but the hero smiled and said it was alright. He declined, for he preferred to walk when traveling. Isa waved goodbye and thought that wagons also made him seasick. He sent Aaron a letter from Sorat, informing him that they were heading to one. If he was anywhere near Odin, the lad was betting she'd contact him somehow. Of course, unlike his previous life, he couldn't know for sure if she'd gotten the letter. By the way, the hero wondered if he would also get motion sickness on the boat. If he could travel by boat, it would be able to contribute to the considerable variety of his travels. Isa noticed the signpost by the roadside and thought he would ask Driz to let him ride next time he returned to Sorat. Finally, after some time, the boy reached the city of Jampaman. He was like a stone Titanic adrift in a sea of gold. Actually, that's just a quote from a poet who lives here. But even just knowing this phrase, the hero felt stronger in spirit or something. This time, he decided to use his blacksmith's license to enter. He didn't plan to stay here for a long time, but he would like to work at the forge for a while. It had been a long time since the last time he had been in the business. Disclosing his name and being recognized in this county would help him reduce the guards' surveillance. Isa stopped by the inn where he was greeted by a friendly girl. She wished him a good evening and asked what purpose he had come here for. The hero replied that he needed a room, but he would not refuse dinner either. The girl shouted to her mother that they had a night guest and said that a room alone cost 50 copper coins. Dinner cost 12 copper coins and breakfast at 8. She also wanted to know the name of their visitor. As soon as the hero took off his hat and showed his face, the girl was shocked. She told Mr. Eyes that his room was right there and asked him to leave his suitcase and go down to dinner. She turned to Ace and nervously told him that the bath and laundry would cost 5 coins each. As the girl led the elf to his room, she glanced at Ace, but noticing his gaze on her again, she was startled and blushed. She was embarrassed, but she dared to ask if the hero was really an elf. But suddenly she panicked sharply and said that she shouldn't have pestered the guests with such questions. But to her surprise, the hero patted her on the head. The guy smiled and said that she was right and he was indeed an elf. He suggested that it was the first time the girl had seen an elf, and she seemed to glow with joy. The girl said that she had seen elves as she passed by them, but none of them had been her guest yet. She opened the door with the key to his room and asked him to take care not to lose his key. It was a little rustic inside, but the bed was worth its money. There was a beautiful rose vase on the table, and the guy thought he might be staying here for a while. Of course, it would all depend on the food. The first course was waiting for the lad at the Jampion. The girl served the hero with wine, wheat bread and bacon with pasta and white sauce. Ace was delighted with the taste of this dish. Isa ate every last crumb and the girl suggested that he enjoyed it very much. The boy smiled and said that it was excellent. The food was more than satisfactory and he would definitely stay at this inn while he was in this city. Later, the hero made his way to the Principality of Trevian, the Guild of Jampaman Blacksmiths. Isa clarified with the man that he needed 10 spearheads at deadline for 1 silver coin each. The boys entered the forge, and the man said that here the hero would find everything he needed. He figured that a job like this was really all he could trust a passerby to do, and Eyes understood him. The men working inside were surprised that an elf had shown up here. His advanced level license from the Ludria and the name of a known dwarf didn't count here. The man showed an example of a spear and asked him to do something similar. The hero examined the tips and realized that the product here was quite crude, and they needed to make 10 of them in a week. But they also didn't have an upper order limit. The guy figured he wouldn't offend anyone if he improved the design as much as he could. He accepted the job while all the people looked at the elven blacksmith in surprise. While Isa was working at the table, he said that he had the finishing touches left to do. All the people around marveled at his dexterity and speed of work. One of the blacksmiths would even say that his work was better than the sample. The hero thanked him for his help and said he would continue tomorrow. The elf waved goodbye to the boys and the blacksmiths asked him to be more careful on his way back. As Isa headed home, he could feel his heart pounding loudly in his chest. Maybe it was just because of how curious they were, but their compliments were certainly nice to him. He remembered the words of his gnome teacher who was surprised that Isa couldn't form the tip correctly and didn't understand why he didn't say so right away. The hero just didn't want to disturb him while he was working, but the gnome got angry and said he shouldn't make a fuss over something like that. In the gnome's opinion, common sense was clearly not characteristic of the sharp-eared man and asked him to observe his training as closely as possible. The hero looked up at the starry sky with a smile and thought he missed Mr. Dwarf who had raised him. But from the elf's point of view, he had parted ways with him not too long ago. The land on which this united union was located was quite fertile, and the people here were not poor. Isa was touring this city today and presented the girl from the inn with a large cake, which she was delighted with. Her name was Nana and today she accompanied him around the city. She was free, so he enticed her to go with him by promising to give her sweets. The hero felt embarrassed, because he would have been arrested for saying such things about a 10-year-old girl in his past life. Isa smiled and offered to eat as much as she wanted. It had been a week since his arrival in Jumpian, and he still needed a guide. He suggested she head back before it got dark and the girl was okay with that. The lad had 6 days of work and 1 day of rest in the Vista Court, and he wanted to stay in good condition. Yesterday he turned in 32 spearheads and he seemed relieved to know he had the day off. The hero really didn't have the right idea about the balance of the spear where everything is centered on the tip. But complaining wouldn't change anything and he was supposed to get another assignment tomorrow. The boy took a handkerchief and wiped the girl's dirty nose, asking her to stop making a mess. Even being a country with fertile land, sweets are quite expensive here. Nana was born and raised here but had never eaten cake, and the hero was glad that there were so many things to try. There was a sweet dried fruit cake filled with cream for silver coins, pancakes drizzled with butter and assorted cookies. Thinking back to the times when he had eaten the same food day after day, he felt much stronger in spirit, enjoying the food. And when Isa remembered that verse about the stone Titanic drifting in the Golden Sea, he felt even better, though not by much. Perhaps this was exactly what was called human culture. Lastly, Isa and the girl ordered themselves a large cake that made Nana drool. Of course, not all of them were willing to enjoy this wealth. The hero overheard people discussing the Drachen army that had invaded northern Zaire, for which the Azd alliance might have been called. Northern Zaire was a warlike country of mercenaries, and the Dratians were a nomadic people with a strong cavalry command. At least that was what the hero remembered. Nana noticed something was wrong with Eyes and asked about it. The guy smiled and said it was fine and let her have half of his cake. The hero thought it was funny how she gorged on the cake, almost eating her fork with it. Isa decided that if he wanted to know all the details, he should have asked about it tomorrow at the Blacksmith Guild. The next day, the Blacksmith Guild said that the Azid's alliance could be convened, but this was all still not certain. All the blacksmiths knew was that some of the northern countries of the Eastern United Alliance were sending support to Northern Zaire. The hero wiped away his sweat with a towel and thought for a moment. It probably didn't mean that he had any intentions of personally joining the war, but he had a bad feeling. In any case, everyone around him was delighted with the sword Isa was working on and exclaimed that it looked really neat. The blacksmiths thought he would be an example they would have to look up to and thought he was too good. The next job that Isa got after arrowheads was forging the greatest sword he was capable of, and the price of it was unlimited. Apparently, the type of sword could also be of no difference whatsoever. The hero inspected its blade and turned it sideways. The kind of ball he was most familiar with was the straight, one-handed sword used in the Shogi Ryu school. While Isa was inspecting the sword, one of the blacksmiths impatiently decided that it was already finished. The guy decided to go out and try to give it a few swings. One of the blacksmiths suggested that they should do practice swings too, but his colleague shook his head negatively. The hero left the room and thought that practicing the Shogi Ryu style was completely focusing his mind. Focusing on the perfect sword shape, the perfect size, weight and balance. Obviously, he hadn't forgotten that yet and swung the sword. But the hero was still in search of that for now and his heart was blazing. He needed to give shape to what he saw in his mental gaze, even if only partially. Isa knew that the only ones who could understand him were his two masters. But that was enough for him, and in fact it might even be more than enough. Everyone else only needed to see the result of his work. The guy smirked and decided that his weapon would speak for itself and his final product was finally ready. Time passed and the hero worked on his sword blade by the fire every day. All the blacksmiths were ecstatic and thought his work was incredible. They didn't know how they were supposed to repeat such a thing. At the end of the working day, the hero barely reached the hotel and collapsed tiredly on the bed. He was completely exhausted, for he had been working his ass off for about 3 weeks straight. He had worked without a day off, trying to perfect the sword to his satisfaction. The payment was a substantial sum of 10 gold coins. But now Isa had 3 days of not wanting to do anything. Just as he thought of this at his door, someone knocked. It was a Nana who called out to Mr. Isa. She offered to bring his food to his room, and the lad said that would be nice. Of course, the Nana always helped him in any way she could. She would bring as much water to his room as she could carry, so that he could keep his room clean and fresh. She also brought him extra portions of food in confidence. It was simple enough on its own, but the sight of her trying her best to support him motivated Ace. He owed her a lot, and decided that when he was done with this case, he would take her out to eat sweets once more. For now, he couldn't ask the dwarf master to evaluate this sword. Somehow Isa couldn't do anything about it, but he felt a little lonely. His teachers were both more valuable rewards to him than these gold coins. The next morning, the girl made sure the hero hadn't forgotten anything and said they would see each other later. The boy smiled goodbye and said that they would see each other later. When she treated him like that, he really felt tempted to stay at this hotel again someday and realized that Nana was quite savvy. In the end, he stayed at the Jampion much longer than he had planned. He had spent the last 3 days idling and then eating cakes with Nana. It was time for him to move on so he could be on his own if Erna came looking for him. The road from town to town took 2 or 3 days on foot, and he really should have used a map. Isa hoped he was on the right path to Odin. It wasn't too far, but he had to ask for directions here and there. Sure, he could get from town to town in one day using a wagon, but that would make him seasick. On the way, the hero passed some beautiful apple trees, under which he stopped for the night. The next morning the lad assumed he was already in Ardino territory. Ardino was widely known for its fruit. The hero noticed a couple of small spirits circling around an apple and offering to let him eat it. Isa appreciated their offer, but to others it would probably look like stealing to him. As soon as he thought about it, he jumped up on the spot at the rumble behind him. An apple orchard was attacked by a greedy big boar and the orchard worker asked someone to get an adventurer in here. By his shouts he attracted the boar who wanted to attack the man. Bursting the ground under his hooves, he made his way toward the frightened worker. As soon as the men started to run away, the boar chased them into the attack. But the hero noticed this and snatching his bow from behind his back, pierced the boar's leg with an arrow. The animal ignored his arrow and still rushed at the hero in the same way, and then Isa let a second arrow fly. The arrow hit the boar directly in the head, and the boar screamed. When the animal fell to the ground, all the surrounding people began to worry about Adel's well-being. The hero killed this boar to save the man. If he just let it end this way, the boar's death would be in vain. The guy didn't want his meat and other materials to be thrown away, and picked up his fallen hat. Isa told the men that he would like to dismember the animal and refrigerate the meat, and asked them to show him where the watering holes were. He would also appreciate their help if they would help him carry the boar. Toward the end of the day, the man decided to thank their savior and asked to raid the food. In front of the hero stood a variety of hearty dishes, including juicy boar meat that made the guy drool. He was madly glad that now it would not go to waste and licked his lips. The man wanted to talk to the hero about the hide. Looking at the map, there was a village here called Palner. Between here and Foka there was a lake called Zare on the bank of the river. The people used all the water they had for washing, laundry, and cutting hides, and perhaps the hero could leave it there. Skinning a hide could easily take months if done carefully. The lad had no doubt that was quite a long time even for him, and he could probably afford to wait. But Isa remembered about the Airn and decided he couldn't afford to wait that long. He thanked the man for everything and said he would leave tomorrow. The man suggested that it might not be what he wanted to hear right now, but he could stay here as long as he wanted. After all, he owed him his life. Isa admitted that he was in a bit of a hurry, and the man suggested that he could stay at least one more day. But the boy decided it was wiser to keep to himself and leave while he still had the chance. He said goodbye with a smile to the people who had sheltered him for the night. In the city of Palner, the hero handed over the boar skin to a leather seller. Isa would have liked to know how the skin was cut, but he really had to hurry. He decided that he would pick it up after he came here next time. On his way, Isa also met a wagon load of people who were staying overnight by the fire. The next day the lad reached Lake Zaire, and the sight seemed to him quite marvelous. It wasn't even the sea, but nevertheless, the lake reached all the way to the horizon, and it was as if it didn't end. Lake Zaire was considered part of the Republic of Zaire just beyond Foka. When Isa approached the fishermen, they warned him that his hat was about to fly off in the wind. The journey from Halka to Laurent took all day from morning to evening by boat. The drum was needed to help the workers stay in synchronization. It also allowed aggressive monsters to focus their attention on the stern of the ship, protecting the rest of the ship. That was the whole point of it. While the hero was traveling on the boat, the people that accompanied him were constantly beating a drum, and the hero found this sight amazing. Perhaps it's just because of the vast open space, but it felt even more than twice as easy traveling by wagon. Adel said that Laurent is similar to Foka for the most part. The two towns were designed to be reflections of each other on the two sides of the lake or something like that. Just one night in Laurenta, and he would finally make it to Odin. But in the end Isa thought he was a bit rushed. If he hadn't spent so much time in the Jampion, maybe he could have explored these cities a little more. But he didn't regret anything. The hero remembered with a smile his wonderful journey up to this point. Odin was the land of magic, and somewhere out there, just beyond the horizon, was his goal. When the protagonist arrived at one of the Laurents, it was already evening. He talked to many people on the way in town, and it seemed that the first thing he had to do was to go to the government office. He also apologized to the young lady for bothering them so late, but the old lady smiled and said it was all right. The first step to becoming a mage is to see if he has the ability to do so in the state office. The hero smiled slyly and thought about the fact that morning would not come soon. The guy made it to the state office of Odin. Magic was a process in which internal magic power and mana was converted into energy through the use of special techniques and spells, and it was all to fulfill the desired result. But if he couldn't pass this test, then he wouldn't be able to learn magic at all in Odin. The hero thought about what he should do next if he still couldn't pass the test. It was a little late for him to say that, but he is 90% here due to his optimism. To just start using magic, he needed to possess enough mana in his body as well as have an innate talent to control it. Unexpectedly, the girl asked the number 8 ace to come over to them. There were many magical things in this world, but the only thing he could study was magic. The girl escorted the hero into a room where a mustachioed uncle sat at a table. Looking at his face to the guy, it seemed that something was wrong, but the uncle smiled and asked him to sit down. The thing is that he had never seen elves on this test before, so he was very surprised and apologized. The man laughed and admitted that he had seen gnomes here a few times. The hero gave the man a sullen look and asked for clarification. Apparently, the gnomes had come to take the test more than a dozen times, all to create magic equipment. The dwarves wanted to learn magic so they could enchant their work in the forge. Isa got excited at the thought of a magical sword and thought it was great, and he definitely wanted to make one. The man replied that only 2 had passed that test, but that was quite some time ago. However, it wasn't only magic equipment that was needed in this field. They needed the ability to use it as well. In any case, sorcery was more reliable with abilities, and it became clear to Ace. The man opened the box and showed I's 2 test tools. The hero was delighted, for he had never seen such material before. He had to take 1 piece in each hand and carefully connect their tips. The satisfied hero tried to do this, and to his surprise, light appeared at the ends of the sticks. The man smiled and remarked that this was very good. He said that his abilities were wonderful, and the hero was insanely happy about it. Isa also wanted to buy those ones, but the man didn't think that was possible. If the hero intended to learn magic here, the man asked for permission to tell him about the different options. The first method was the Military Magic Academy. There, one could learn magic and its application in warfare. But unfortunately, to study there, one had to have citizenship of the Eastern United Union. The guy decided that it didn't apply to him, and he wasn't going to join the military anyway. The second option was the Adventurer Academy. Here one could learn how to fight monsters and use magic for self-defense. Also, he would commit to work for 3 years after graduation in the United League. The hero decided that wasn't his option either. The third option is the Academy of Fundamental Magic. As the name suggests, this is where they study the simple fundamentals of magic, and Isa decided that this wasn't his option either. And the fourth option would be to learn from a magician. The hero's eyes immediately lit up, but for whatever reason the man looked unsure. The thing was, magic today couldn't rely on combining power from communicating with their spirit. And if he was going to teach magic, the man had no doubt that he would face envy and quick rejections. But one is a place meant for learning magic. And if he had any problems, the man wanted to ask not to be shy and address him. Besides, he officially welcomed Ace to their city. The next week after the test, the hero approached a large number of mages, hoping they would accept him as an apprentice. But every one of them treated him with hostility and continually refused him. He must have been quite persistent in asking to be accepted as a disciple. But thinking back to his past masters, Isa believed that there was no trace of hostility in them then. As a result, he did encounter envy and refusals. As his motivation faded, he began to put his energy into working at the forge. For the past 3 weeks he had been making both weapons and armor. Come to think of it, the master dwarf must have suspected that this might have happened. Isa remembered his work with him. When he mentioned that he intended to learn the art of sword making and magic, he remembered that the man had said something similar. The dwarf thought that his communication with spirits was already part of magic. He practiced blacksmithing to keep himself active. The hero didn't know if he should have just gritted his teeth and joined the Fundamental Magic Academy. It sounded too easy to him. While he was thinking about it, a man approached him and apologized for bothering him. He had news about today's delivery. The hero had another order for 3 swords and for arrowheads. While they were talking, a third figure appeared behind the man, which caught Ace's attention. It was a young boy who was taller than Eyes that looked at the elf carefully. He wanted to make sure that the elf and the blacksmith named Isa were in front of him. The hero did not understand anything, but said that he was the elf and blacksmith known as Isa. Suddenly the lad knelt down before him and asked the elf to take him as his apprentice. It was more than unexpected for him. Isa wanted to go far away, but the guy clutched at him with his hands and asked him to stop. He grabbed the hero's legs and said he wouldn't let him go until he accepted him as an apprentice. In the end, Isa decided to listen to him after all, just so long as he would let him go. Meanwhile, rumors spread that Isa, who was a real hard worker, had found a new apprentice. The heroes sat down on the crates and Isa hoped the guy had calmed down a bit. The young lad introduced himself as Koshman Fiddle. He was a mage and had his own workshop. Isa was amazed that at his age he already had his own workshop, but he didn't understand why an experienced mage like him would want to learn blacksmithing. The thing is, he wanted to create a magic sword and the hero thought the idea was cool. It so happened that a few years ago, Koshman was already an apprentice. His master was the mage Randall, which was a dwarven mage that was rarely found in Odin. Randall had his own workshop in the city where he could create with his tools, researching magical equipment and so on. Following his example, Koshman began to study magical equipment, mastering sorcery. But then he left the city a few years ago. Rydal was ordered to return to the Dwarf Kingdom. At least the Koshman got the basic knowledge of magic. Lastly, his teacher said that he had to rely only on himself for the rest of his growth journey. From then on, the lad could only use off-the-shelf tools when researching magical equipment, and he was now a full-fledged mage in Odin. But he knew nothing about blacksmithing. Things became clear to the hero, but he didn't understand why he needed to search for him specifically. Isa thought that he could learn blacksmithing anywhere, but that was exactly the point. The moment he saw his sword in the store, he knew he had to learn from Isa, not anyone else. At first, the guy was sure that a master from the Dwarf Kingdom was coming to town. He immediately went to the blacksmith's guild to see for himself. He questioned the smiths about the sword and who forged it, at which point he was told that it was the work of an eyes. He could hardly believe that the maker turned out to be an elf, but the guild man said that it was licensed under the tutelage of a dwarf. So when the Koshman heard of this, he came here as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the hero was only worried about how his personal information could have been leaked. So the Koshman pleaded with the hero and swore that he would do anything. He wished Isa would teach him his skills. Memories of his request to become an apprentice came over the hero. He had always been able to insist, even though there was a side of him at the time that wanted to back down. He didn't even realize that he was doing the same thing, and he should have at least listened to the Koshman. Isa smirked and decided to make sure that the Koshman was truly willing to do anything for this. He smiled at the lad and told him that he would teach him blacksmithing if the lad would teach him sorcery. After all, Isa also wanted to make a magic sword. Koshman blushed with excitement and gladly agreed to his proposal. This meeting with Koshman could have been just a matter of fate, but to be honest, the hero was annoyed that it turned out to be him. The Koshman took the hero to his workshop and invited him to go inside first. The boy apologized for the intrusion and went in. He was delighted with the place, for it reminded him of a gnome master blacksmith. Koshman smiled and said he would fire up the furnace. The hero asked the lad what he would like to do and what his wishes were. Koshman spread a smile and confessed that he would like to do anything. He just wanted to hear the sound of iron forging again. The hero noticed that Koshman really loved his dwarf master, but Isa was sure that he loved his own even more. But since they were going to create a magic sword, the hero decided that they would start with an ordinary sword. In the end, Isa was the blacksmith and Koshman was the mage, and if they ever disagreed, they would solve it with rock, scissors, paper. The boy laughed and remembered that his master had done the same. They were both birds that could not fly on one wing, but by working together, they would be able to fly toward their goal and create a magic sword. And by the time they would no longer need each other for that, Isa was sure he could happily call the Koshman his friend. The next morning, the boys began their sorcery lessons. First, they had to learn the control of mana in his body. Koshman asked Ace to try to extract his mana without using magic tools and to gather his power at his fingertips. This was to be done slowly. The hero attempted to do so, and to the Koshman's surprise, he succeeded instantly. The Koshman did not realize this, for it is a serious obstacle for humans. But apparently elves are something else. He probably didn't even know that he was dealing with a high elf. But the Koshman smiled and admitted that it would sometimes save them and it was worth it to move on to the next technique. Speech also affected his mana and was part of the formula. Determination, patterns, and so on. In combination, all of these things made magic possible. All that was needed was to find out how these formulas affected mana. One had to analyze all the recorded rules governing it, then combine them to perform the spell. And to summarize magic, it is the accumulated work of countless generations of magicians. The hero was shocked at how many magic books lay before him. Now he understood it all, and it made more sense. From a mage's point of view, borrowing spirit power like the elves did and how he could use it might have seemed dishonest. But he hadn't realized it before. But Koshman explained that it was the same as calling the ability of birds to fly or the fire-breathing ability of dragons dishonest. This was ridiculous. He saw no use for the envy the hero was trying to impose on him. If he had the will and ability to learn magic, then he had as much right to do so as anyone else. The Koshman's words sank into the hero's soul and Isa thanked him. The Koshman's eyes lit up and he decided that they would move on to the forging in the afternoon. He also wanted to know what the very first thing the hero was able to forge. The hero thought it was nails and the Koshman was surprised, and thus they began to learn witchcraft and blacksmithing every day. The heroes talked at length about the perfect shape for the magic sword, and between work they dreamed like children. They kept each other's innocent and naive conversations going. While the hero was having a snack, he was reading books and Koshman offered to take him a picture book. Isa thought about the fact that they were simple boys after all. And boys couldn't help but fall in love with the idea of a fantastic weapon beyond imagination. Isa thought it must be the sharpest in the world, but it seemed to Koshman that it should also shoot fire. After the hero had lived alone for some time, he received a letter and a parcel. The parcel contained the very skin of a greedy boar. In the letter was news from Erina, who addressed the noble Isa. The royal family of Ludrian had sentenced to execution all the nobles against the elves. However, they believed that the nobles acted independently of the country as a whole, and there was no formal apology to the elves. But this is exactly what the hero expected. In 3 or 5 years, the forests of Ludria would become crowded monster refuges. They've already decided that none of the elves who emigrated will return to Ludria without an official public apology. And an apology from the royal family was probably a long way off. The lad feared it might be more than a decade before he spoke to Master Kina again. In the meantime, the Koshman offered the hero some tea. As for the rest of Isa's inquiries, there was one elf carrying a human child. It was still unknown whether the child would be able to communicate with spirits, and after reaching a certain age, the head of the village wished for Isa to come and take custody of it. The boy thought about the fact that the life expectancy of a half-blood elf was at least half that of a pure-blood elf, and settlements of elves tended to raise children altogether. They wanted him to watch the child growing up so fast, and that would be pretty cruel. But he was one of the ones who asked that the half-breeds not be returned to the land and had to take full responsibility for his words. He didn't know if he really had what it took to raise this child with the love he deserved. Of course, it was a real emotional swing for Ace. If it's a boy, they'll be able to catch bugs and go fishing in peace, but if it's a girl, he'll love her endlessly. A child does not necessarily have to be able to talk to spirits. It is only natural for a child to be unfriendly with his friend's parents. There were countless paths in life: blacksmithing, sword master, sorcery, and anything else. And if this child wanted to take a new path, they could take it with eyes together. And even if the hero eventually outlives him and the child dies before the hero, he will still show him his love. The hero readily recognized that he was called a selfish and condescending pointy-eared elf. That was why he was sure he had what it took to be his protector and closest friend. In his reply letter, Isa wrote that he was looking forward to bringing this child into the world, even though it was still a long way off. During the first year, Isa, along with Koshman, practiced meditation. While meditating, the hero had an idea. Magic tools were quite unusual because magic had to be put into them in order to use them. The idea was that the one using them could just do magic. Koshman would even note that using regular magic was faster. That was usually true, but if he was ambushed, using magic tools would be better. If their spell included speech, rushing could completely incapacitate him. But if he has a magic tool that only needs a single moment to activate, in that case it would be more reliable. Literally a lifesaver. The wizard was capable of casting any number of spells, making a magic tool with one single function impractical. Therefore, a magic item should be adapted for one-time use, and this would increase its value. Koshman really didn't know, but in any case it is unknown whether such a tool would ever be used and whether it would even work. But it sounded pretty fun, and the Koshman suggested that the hero try to make it work. The hero thought a short metal stick would work best for this, and the Koshman said they would start small. Both were quite eager. The protagonists ended up spending a lot of time on their research and work. The third year went by, and their practice of magic was pretty simple. A mage's power lay in the number of spells he could use, so learning was simple memorization. By the way, the hero had a pretty good memory, but for what he was interested in, and no matter how many times he was called stupid or worse. During those 3 years, the boys had several developments. The Drachen army invaded the north of the United Alliance in northern Zaire in full force. Therefore, the Kingdom of Northern Zaire requested support from the Azid Alliance. Students from the Military Magic Academy were also sent there, and one of those students brought their staff to the battle. In the end, he saved lives. The Draught cavalry made a rear night raid on the camp, and this student panicked, but still managed to set up a protective barrier. The novice mage was able to survive the surprise attack, and the army mages were apparently stunned. Their small protective staff immediately attracted a lot of attention. The army appreciated its worthiness, so the army mages started using it on a regular basis. At this point, Koshman was the only researcher in all of Odin specializing in magic tools. The hero told the Koshman that he had received requests to learn how to create magical tools and thought he had accepted any of them. But to his surprise, the Koshman declined. But the hero thought that if he saw his apprentice grow up, he would become a full-fledged magician, and the Koshman said he was twice wrong. He was here to study magic tools and swords. But Isa knew that the Koshman had to publish his study. If he just became a hermit, no one else would be able to study magic tools and their uses. The military bigwigs had to tie his hands to force him to publish his research. Koshman told a buddy that he didn't care about rights or concessions or anything like that. But the hero said that once he publishes the Reuda, they can move on to the magic sword. That way the Koshman can create a spell, and Isa will engrave it on the blade. and the sooner he's done with it, the sooner they'll be done. The Koshman is quite downcast, but agrees with the hero. He smiled and said that he would get it done as soon as possible, so that Isa could better prepare for forging swords. Isa was impatient, and the boys pounded each other with their fists. After 2 years, the hero had to leave to take care of the half-blood elf, but he was sure that by then he and Koshman would have finished teaching each other their respective skills. Thus, in 2 years, they are both going to leave this nest, each with a crafted magic sword in hand. This will require everything of their combined abilities. Obviously, they would have to start by creating a prototype. Therefore, Isa asked the Koshman to hurry up and publish his work. After that, they would sit over their work for days and nights, and at the end of the day they would drop dead on the floor. They worked their asses off. While the Koshman worked on their work and books, the hero was busy with their sword. It was now the 4th year that the boys had finally achieved their goal. They took an enthusiastic look at the weapon and exclaimed that they had created a magic sword. Koshman thought the first thing they should do was test the blade, but Isa wanted to test the functions. The elf was burning with impatience and asked the Koshman to channel his magic into this sword. The lad was fine with it and attempted to do so. In the end, their sword really sparkled with magic, which the guys were thrilled about. That was the real reason they met, and their magic sword was finally made. The hero smiled, thinking about the fate that could have brought them together. Holding the sword in his hands, tears welled up in the Koshman's eyes and Isa trembled at the influx of emotions. The hero would also like to try this sword and hold it in his hands, but the Koshman did not want to give him this sword for long. Eventually, it was time to make his own magic sword. The boys sat at work and meditated by the stove for days on end as usual. In the 5th year, the examination on the art of combat began. A man from the group asked Isa if he was ready for it. The hero was getting his mage certification and said he was ready for it. Koshman has set his bar too high with his wands and magic swords. If he doesn't officially become a wizard, he's effectively blocking the way for less experienced mages. The chief wizards of Odin were practically begging him to take the exam, but neither the Koshman nor the hero cared about rank, honor, or any such nonsense. Isa used fire magic and used a flaming ball to destroy the target stone. But there were people in this world who would go to any lengths to remove obstacles, and until Koshman became an official mage, he was one. A hero had to make him one of the mages. In short, he was repaying him for all that the Koshman had done for him. Isa, who was a pupil of Koshman Fiddle, passed his examination and the lad thanked the examiners. When the hero returned back to the forge, the Koshman asked Isa how it had gone. The lad smiled and said that he now looked up to the elven blacksmith as well as a mage named Isa. Koshman congratulated the hero, or rather thanked him for his help. He assumed that the hero would now go to retrieve the half-breed child, and Isa confirmed his thought. It had been 5 years since he had started learning magic, and now his magic sword was ready. And it was time for him and Koshman to travel on their separate roads. They both worked hard on their swords. Koshman confessed that he had never really liked children, but he would be interested to see a child raised by eyes. The hero suggested that the children were too noisy for him and Koshman agreed. Ace was really curious if the Koshman was ever going to pass on his knowledge and skills to anyone else. In all those 5 years, he never showed the slightest hint of interest in a romantic relationship. Apparently, he was too busy researching, and the hero was his only student for the entire time. Isa figured that even if his knowledge and skills weren't permanent, what he could do with his hands would stay with him. There was a certain appeal in that. Still, the hero would never realize how strange it was. The guy looked at his sword, which was optimized for his own use. His magic sword had a thin blade that was difficult to make. The hero bet that the master gnome would want to split it in half if he saw it. But as long as he filled it with his magic, even a hammer would bounce off this sword with no problem. They could be sure that it wouldn't break or dull, and that was very cool. The spell engraved on it increased its strength and sharpness, and even the hero's scabbard was made of elven silver. He drew magic just by being around it, and it's something like a magic sword. Isa told the Koshman he was wrong. Elven silver drew magic from mere physical contact. Thus, he could channel magic into the sword through the scabbard by simply putting it on. As said, one could expect the unexpected. On the other hand, the only person who could see the value that Isa saw in his magic sword was his swordsmith. The Koshman's magic sword is obviously the stronger of the two, and it is incredibly narrow in its application. Now, since he had a fire blade, the hero suggested he switch to an ice blade. Combining them would be pretty nifty, and the Koshman thought it sounded pretty cool. Koshman was Ace's sidekick and his rival. but the roads they traveled diverged just as their magic swords could not have been similar. Koshman escorted the hero to the end of the city and said he would stay here. The boys said goodbye to each other and the Koshman waved to the hero one last time. Maybe the child half-blood he would one day want to become a mage, and then maybe Isa would come back here with him in one. By the time this happens, the Koshman may be in middle age, maybe even old age. On the way along with the spirits, the hero gazed dreamily at the sky. He would like to show the Koshman a brand new magic sword that he would definitely create by then. The boy was sure it would be a breakthrough. Before joining Arena in the town of Zaints, the guy tried to figure out the local geography with his own maps. He had just learned sorcery, and it was quite fun. In Hollerith, the affairs of the elves had led to the fall of the nobility, and the concentration of the royal family's influence. The number of demons in the country was apparently increasing, and what would happen next was for all to see. The Republic of Vilestrike had some pretty tasty fish, and Ludria was famous for its pottery. Ace wondered if he could make it to the capital of Zaints in a couple days and thought of the High Elf's children. He wondered what this meeting would be like. The hero stayed at an inn in Swizzy, the capital of Zainza. The lad noticed that the beds here were quite soft, as suddenly someone knocked on his door. The girl greeted the hero and apologized for the intrusion. It was Erna, who smiled at Mr. Ace and said that it had been a long time. As far as she remembered, that was how they met him last time, and Isa complimented her that she looked much better than last time. He heard that the Ludrians were already at the negotiating table, which meant they were close to apologizing to the elves. The hero motioned for Ern to sit down and the girl thanked him. She said that in the eastern part of the country where the incident occurred, many residents had emigrated for fear of disaster. The food reserves of the eastern part of the country were dwindling and crops were becoming low. Leather products were lost and the country was in trouble and no one wanted the land to be touched again. This, coupled with the cessation of exports to Pology, had other countries looking out for them. Now the kings felt it was a good time to go on the offensive. Erna thought the royals would act while they were still able to rebuild. The hero knew it was a little early, but thanked her, for he wouldn't have achieved this result if it weren't for Erna. The girl smiled and said that she was just imitating Master Isu and did as she wished. They didn't need Claes and Martina, and she didn't want the country her loved ones lived in to fall apart. In response, the hero smiled and remembered all his acquaintances in that kingdom. Of course, there were still many questions, living in the night cities and helping the elves in the forests. But the hero had no doubt that Arena would do everything on her own. In his eyes, she was undoubtedly a true hero, so he didn't think he should have worried about anything. By the way, the hero wanted to know where the little elf was, and Ern said he was here. Based on her answer, the lad assumed it was a boy. Barely had he rejoiced when the girl warned him that he was currently napping. But she asked the genie to tell him when he would wake up, and the hero crouched back down. The guy decided he could wait, and the Ern wanted to clarify something. She wasn't at all sure she could have asked it. Erna knew how much he loved them. That's why it was so important to half-elves who had less time to live than they did. The girl was afraid it would break Master Isu's heart. The hero wondered if she was worried about his heart or if she was comparing her to him. Erna was worried about how long her life would last after he was gone and decided to keep Clues, a human male, because she was afraid he would die. Of course, the hero couldn't think that far ahead, but said that even she would die much sooner than he did. And if that should scare him in any way, then he would no longer be able to have anything to do with anyone. And he didn't want to live like that. One of his friends from his past life said something to him. Regret no more than a prompt for reflection. He didn't remember much about him anymore, but those words remained in his memory. Judging from the spirit that flew over their heads, the hero realized that the child was already awake. He left the Ern with a smile and said he was leaving. On the way, the hero thought about the humans, dwarves, and half-elves. They didn't want to stop being involved, even if their lifespans were different. Even if he had a long life ahead of him, and an even longer one as a spirit. Right now, he would like to choose the path of no regrets and live life to the fullest. As soon as Isa saw the child waking up, he grabbed his heart and thought he was a real cutie. The baby stared questioningly at the guy, and the hero thought that this baby didn't have a name yet, so he just greeted him. The little elf looked into the hero's eyes and said that it was indeed beautiful. He was referring to the immortality of the higher elf soul, and reached out his small hand to Ace's face. The boy remembered when he had met Arena, that was how she had defined being a high elf. He smiled, thinking that this child had a very keen eye. This meant that he had a certain ability of an elf. If the hero could summon spirits for help, it would make his life easier, and he would have a friend who would be by his side the whole time. He meant that to the outside world it would look rather strange. The child grabbed Ace's cheeks, and the boy stroked the half-elf's head. For whatever reason, they were both having fun. Irina's letter said he was born in the winter, and they hadn't had time to name the baby yet. In that case, the boy decided that wasn't a bad thing. He smiled at the baby and said that from now on he would be called Win. He introduced himself by his name and said that the higher elves of the forest also called him Maple Guy, and of today he was his guardian and friend. Isa asked the call to become him if the wine was okay with him. The boy shyly lowered his head, and the hero said it was a pleasure to meet him. Win kept touching the boy's face and Ace said it was good to see him. He picked the kid up in his arms, and full of happiness that he could take care of him. Isa exclaimed that he was glad that Win was born and most of all happy that he was with him. But after that, the hero put the baby back and didn't know what to do next. He thought that if they traveled without a plan, it would be hard for Win, and if Aaron found out about it, he would have to give her a sermon. The hero didn't want the Erna to base feed him, but they would still need to work. Isa thought it would be a good idea to show Win what a working adult looked like. The only question remaining was who would help him sit with the Win for that time. The truth was that Emma was the one who was the best. She was a real thunderstorm in Rudria, and Isa decided to stop until the king apologized and the country calmed down. Karina of Vilestria was reliable, but for being a secret spy in the city, Kushman from Odin was definitely not suitable, as he would definitely teach Vin a few bad games. Plus, he said he didn't like children. Erna was surprised and couldn't believe that they were thinking ahead. Of course, she didn't mean anything in a bad way. They had the opportunity to do almost anything, and they could judge and react to any situation on the spot. After all, the hero was also growing up. Irene asked when they planned to leave and the hero said it would be tomorrow around noon. The hero ended up taking the wine on the trip and said goodbye to Aaron. They walked the streets with him together, slept together, and snacked on sweet fruits. Isa adopted the child for several reasons. When they entered the inn, the hero offered the Win to greet the girl. Nana was delighted with him and said that she enjoyed meeting Win. She also asked to tell her anything as long as they were here. The girl was madly eager to hug Win and pet him, and Isa didn't mind. The thing is, the hero was looking for someone who could look after Win while he was working. For this reason, he came to town. Of course, it had to be someone he could trust, and he remembered her. Of course, he would pay her well, if she was okay with that. The plan was for them to stay in town for a year or two. Nana enthusiastically accepted his offer and said she would take care of it. She would make sure his mom said an absolute yes. Besides, the girl was insanely happy that Isa still remembered her. She smiled at the child and suggested that he stay at her house. This was great for the hero. Apparently Win didn't understand yet, but Isa was sure he would get used to it in time. The hero hoped that he could get used to his new surroundings and suggested that they make an effort together. Of course he felt better, but he was starving and asked what they were having for dinner tonight. They were having pasta casserole tonight, so she thought it would be easy for Vin to eat them. Seeing such an amazing dish for the first time wines was a thrill. The apples he ate there were delicious. The elves were madly in love with apples and wondered if many elves would come if they served apple dishes. The hero smiled and corrected him, saying that elves loved fruit. But the hero thought her pie was very tasty. He liked meat and fish and all the vegetables, but still the fish was the best. The boy thought he was insanely lucky and waited impatiently for the Vin to get a little bigger. He would like to visit different places and try different delicious food. The hero thought that Win would really enjoy traveling and he would like to travel with him together. Isa couldn't look at him and smiled warmly. Compared to him, this child didn't have much time. Suddenly, a man passing by noticed the hero and approached him. It was a member of the blacksmith guild that apologized for distracting him. He was going to ask that the guy stop by to see him later. Isa had only worked for him for a few weeks, about 6 years ago. He was pleased to see that he hadn't forgotten him. Perhaps he would ask him to do some work. The hero decided that he would not work for a while so that he could spend time with wine. He decided that he would contact the union a little later and tried the tea, which had not been here before. A month had passed since then. A man wanted to tell Eyes about a job he would like to assign to him. The first would be repairing armor that the city guards use. For example, he would be paid for the amount of work done. And the second is technical leadership. In their association of blacksmiths, the sword that Isa used to wield was on display. Hearing this, the guy was very proud of it. The man who heard that the man had returned to the city asked him to go somewhere. He didn't want to bother the hero, but he still had some business to attend to. And the third moment, it was an audience with the king, who was interested in the elven blacksmith. The man said that the hero could choose what was to his liking, and Isa wondered. He liked the first task, which was to repair the armor and thank the man for the amount of work. The man agreed and said that with his skills the hero could make a lot of money. However, if he turned down another job, there was no way their association could stop him. The guy said that if he didn't do well, he would be very grateful if they helped him with advice, and the man smiled. He said that the hero would labor in the forge as before. There he was also very proud to be able to work beside Eyes, a blacksmith like him, and escorted the lad to the forge. Quite some time passed and the hero met again the blacksmiths he used to work with. All were madly happy to see him and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. They greeted Ace, who was very happy to be back here. Every time the hero went to work with tears in his eyes, because Win was always cranky and begged him not to go anywhere. The girl held the baby in her arms all the time and wished Ace good luck at work. She looked at the crying Wine and thought that not long ago he couldn't even talk. The girl tried to calm him down and suggested that they go out and play in the evening. Nana suggested that little Win go to the well, for he had quite a few friends there. Win immediately stopped crying and decided to go there. Win played quite nicely with his peers, and soon he would be quite big. Win was playing with the rest of the town kids. One of the boys wanted to show them something and took Win under his arm. He frightened the boy by putting a cockroach under his nose. Win hid behind the Nana, and the girl thought it didn't turn out very pretty. She hugged him and confessed that she wished he could always be like this. She asked him to tell her what Win would like to do now. The hero was going to use today's day off to go camping and teach Win something. There was an awesome view just outside of town. Apparently it was too early to teach Win how to fight and had to wait until he was older, so he could learn something else in nature. Isa decided that they would start with spiritualism. Simply put, it's a way to ask for help from spirits. The nature spirits often help them, and the hero was grateful for it. The spirits were also happy to help them. The wind spirit, who had been around the wine for a long time, was eager to be called upon for help. Isa smiled and asked the boy to take his time. If they wanted to gain more power, many factors would need to be considered. Isa thought that it was still a long way off, and everything was still ahead of them. He had to ask the spirit to do something for them, because it would be a bit difficult for Win. Win reacted to what he was given and was very happy about it. He even began to show what looked like affection, but he was not very good at asking for things on his own. Given Win's upbringing, perhaps this was inevitable. The hero decided that he should have been watched more closely. But that was why Win thought he would like to learn the art of communicating with spirits. To want and seek, not just receive. That's what was really important in life. The hero emptied out a bag of leaves and wished he could ask the wind spirit to let the leaves dance on the trees. Eventually, the wind spirits honored the hero's request and the leaves swirled in the air. Win was delighted and the hero suggested that he ask him to do the same. Apparently, Win and the wind spirit wanted to play a game. Beginning with the art of communicating with spirits, he gradually taught Win everything he knew himself. They also studied counting with him. Win looked like a 4-year-old child, but in fact he was already 7 years old. If he explained things to him clearly, the child would learn quite slowly. In the future, he would need to learn how to use money. The boy praised Win when he counted 2 silver coins correctly. Win was really good at learning. Perhaps it was because he was with a Nana who took care of him. The girl was delighted to see the boy learning quickly and praised him. When the hero thought of giving birth to Wine, he became difficult. But he had no choice but to love him as much as he could and make up for the lack. It was more like overwhelming him with his love. Nana brought the apples on a saucer and asked Win the quantity. The boy answered correctly, saying there were 2 apples. 1 year had passed since then. Nana asked the hero if Win really did not go to church. She was sure that he was very grateful that they were teaching him to read and write and he would socialize more with other children. She handed the bedding to the hero and Isa was in agreement with what she said. He wanted people to see the world according to their own values and not through the lens of other people's values. And when Win got older, he probably wouldn't deny that. The church tested the children who came to the free class for magical abilities. That way, they could become a future priest of the church. Talented children were sent to the church headquarters in exchange for a reward. But the hero didn't have money problems, so he wouldn't want to part with the wine. As an elf, it took him 10 years to age a year. Win as a half-elf, it would take about 2 or 3 years for that margin. Since all human children grew differently, Win would always look younger. This is a problem that Win will definitely have to face over time. The flow of his time as a half-elf was very different from human and the flow of time for the higher elves. The hero thought that there were better places for wine. There were quite a few children not only in the church and Isa turned to Nana. The boy asked a favor of the girl to listen to his long story. He could have just let the story pass his ears. She was a traveler and of a different race. She was already uncomfortable, but he was sure that if he said so, she wouldn't go any further. But there was no way he could deceive her. He told her that he was a high elf and the wines were half elf. And because of her, they were so good together. A year and a half later, Arena sent a letter that Win could enter Rudia. but the guy stubbed his toes and said he wasn't going anywhere and wanted to be with Nana. The hero tried to convince him with all truths and wrongs, but he promised Irene that he would go. Isa thought that Vin really liked it here. He taught him that he should keep his promises. Guy suggested that Vinu make a gift for Nana and thank her for everything and say goodbye. During their walk, the hero suggested to Vin to find a very beautiful stone with the help of a spirit. It took the boy a little time to accomplish this task. In the forge, everyone watched with interest what the hero was doing with this rare stone. After sealing the gift, Vin and Isa decided that she would probably like it. At parting, the boys thanked Nana for her concern and Isa nudged Vin toward the girl. Apparently, he was very nervous and turned to Nana. He handed her a box and said that they had made this with eyes especially for her and he would like to present it to her. She asked his permission to open the gift and was greatly surprised. It was the most genuine pomegranate jewelry. Such a gift was a token of their endless friendship and Nana cried. She confessed that she wished she could see him off and have a little laugh. But the wine also cried and said that he would not like to leave her forever. The hero decided not to delay and took the boy in his arms. The boy screamed, demanding to let him go and called for Nana. The girl, broken with grief, also fell on her knees. As a result, the entire time they spent on the road, Win cried constantly. It didn't matter how much he wanted to, but the hero couldn't leave him alone in the Gempamont. She could probably take care of herself, but she didn't have the same strength as the hero to protect Vin. Though there was no way Isa could delay their departure any longer and feared it was a forced farewell. The hero wished Nana wouldn't cry and he didn't want to hurt her and he felt sorry for her. Isa only wished that their farewell would have been more peaceful. From now on they would head to Ludria and he would help Irene while he mopped up the monsters. The hero didn't want anything to happen to Irina. Besides, Vin would be very upset about it. For Vin to feel the passage of time, Ludria was a good place for him because there are a lot of people there and not only. It didn't mean that they wouldn't be able to see everyone again or come back here again. The hero smiled and suggested he cry until he was tired and then he would get a good night's sleep. The boy told Vin that he could cry as long as he wanted. In Ludria he would be able to make many new friends and Isa reassured Vin that he would be there for him. Vin cried a lot, but they were happy. Or he was angry, but the hero didn't know it. Either way, they had been through a lot. Vin kept crying and wished he could grow up and be a grown-up pre-adult soon. The protagonists together with Win reached the kingdom of Ludoria, but the boy still could not calm down. Because of the earthquake, they couldn't get through the eastern part, and on top of that, the protagonists could feel everyone staring at them. One of the shopkeepers exclaimed that he was that nomad elf. The man assumed that the hero had decided to go back. Isa didn't realize who it was at first, but then he remembered the little man who had made him a new knife. The man smiled and admitted that it was quite a long time ago, but he had heard many rumors about Isa before. The man assumed the guy was going to the Kihai dojo, so he offered to take him something. Naturally, he could take it for free. The guy thanked the seller for the gift of a large piece of meat. He told the salesman that he would be staying in the capital for a while, so if he needed a new knife, he could contact him. The man smiled and said that was fine. A child caught his attention and he asked the hero what kind of little miracle it was. The man smiled at the boy and said that if he wanted meat, let him come into his shop, for he had the best meat in the whole capital. The man said goodbye to the boys and the protagonists hurried to the dojo. As soon as they went up the stairs, the hero noticed that there were many people he didn't know. A group of guys warned the elf with the child that this was a dojo of the Asogi and outsiders were forbidden to enter. Isa smiled and said he was their friend and came with good intentions. He held out the gift to the confused boy, which he thanked the stranger. A female voice was heard behind the group saying that this was an important person for their dojo. In front of them stood the first student that had rebuilt the dojo, and then left it. The girl greeted the ace with a warm smile and thought that he had come a little early. The elf smiled and greeted Master Kihu, saying that it hadn't even been 10 years yet. The girl noticed the little elf and asked who the kid was. The boy picked up the Win in his arms and said that he had picked him up and they had become friends. He offered to introduce himself to him and the Kiha smiled, saying he hadn't changed a bit. Kiha asked the two children named Mizuha and Shizuki to treat Win like a little brother. The children smiled and promised her. Kihai's mother offered to let them occupy the room he slept in earlier, and offered to feed them. The hero would be glad of this and assumed that the two were Kihai's children. Kihai's mother smiled and told Aiz that he had not changed at all. A few weeks had passed since the hero and Win had come to the dojo. The guys were playing outside, until one of the guys called out to Aisu. They understood perfectly well that he was taking care of the children, but offered to pay attention to the master as well. For the past few weeks, the hero had only been forging swords for Kihei and playing with Win and the other children. Since the children came first, they hardly saw each other. When their games came to an end, the hero suggested that all three of them play together without him. For this reason, the disciples became afraid of the master, who boiled with rage for ignoring the ace. The last time the hero had taken up the sword was about a month ago, and the Kia must have grown and become much stronger by now. And if he shows what he can do, maybe she'll stop calling him out. The boy came to the Master Kia and asked for an evaluation of his sword skills. She seemed to have waited too long for that and sighed heavily in response. She surprised the guy by asking him to use not his wooden sword, but the one he carries. It was a magic sword made by a Koshman. The hero didn't think he was ready and would be able to use it to its full potential, but still he drew the sword from its sheath. After making a few swings of the sword, he raised it above his head. The hero noticed the strange looks on the face of Kiha and the others present. After recovering a bit from the shock, the students said they were ecstatic and didn't expect anything less from the first apprentice. It seemed to the boy that he hadn't fallen flat after all, but then he was called out by the Kiha. There was a strange grimace on her face and the hero thought something was wrong. She asked to listen and said that it was not that simple. She wanted to ask him a lot of things, but first she would give her assessment of his skills. The girl saw that he continued to train during his travels and his skills became noticeably better than before, for which Isa was grateful to her. But despite all the training, it seemed to her that he never once used the skills, and she turned out to be right. And tempering one's skills not for combat was nothing more than showmanship. It seemed to her that the hero did not use his sword to become stronger. The hero thought he had once shredded his opponent's sword in a worm strike. But this is no different from the Kihei's street performances, and he has absolutely no combat experience at all. She wanted to tell him that he had stalled on the same thing as his master, and at this rate, she didn't think he could develop skills as a swordsman. Tia concluded that Ace's biggest weakness was his lack of fighting spirit, but she smiled softly and admitted that this trait suited him very well. The hero pondered how he could fix it, and in the meantime, the Kia ordered the rest of the students to begin sparring. Several weeks had passed since then. Isa found himself in the northern part of Ludoria, near the border with the Fodor Empire. Erna told the lad that they would await his return and handed him a horse. This time, Erna asked him to prevent a possible invasion from the Fodor Empire. Ludoria's military strength was now weakened due to the change of king and the unstable situation. The kingdom had itself to blame, but an occupation could not be allowed, because the hero didn't want the negotiations to be meaningless. The current Ludoria had very close contact with the elves. The elves had no need for new neighbors, and if they were already familiar, it would be easier. Isa thought that being neighbors with them would help the Ludoria in many ways and made it to their destination. It pained him to pile up a path that the humans had paved with their own hands. The hero appealed to the spirits of the earth dwelling in the majestic mountains and asked them to hear his call. In order to block this road, he was ready to collapse a rock. The lad thought it would be decades before the road was built again and the kingdom would stop constantly calling on the elves. He wondered if he would be able to fight the soldiers of the empire or if he would lack the resolve to do so. One could fantasize a bit here, but the hero didn't think he could do something like that. He liked the gracefulness of Kia's sword, so he wanted to fence like her and he almost achieved it. He needed to get stronger, but there was no motivation to do so. Perhaps it's a bit arrogant, but Ace felt like he was strong enough. Therefore, he didn't mind being a regular amateur rather than a professional fencer. But perhaps the time would come when he would change his mind. Erna met the hero on the way back and praised him for his excellent work. Later, the hero decided to tell the Kaheka about it, and the girl answered him with a dejected expression on her face. This was quite like him, and she was sorry that she would not get to see what a great swordsman he would become. Another year passed, and the hero was still a student of the Kihei and living in the Sesogi. He was now forging the sword that was to be a gift to the king at the fair. But the expression on Kihei's face still did not get out of his mind. Isa thought he needed something to distract himself, like a drink and a good meal. He had a great idea to go out with the wine. While the guy was cleaning up his workstation, someone called out to him. The hero asked Shizuka what was the matter and the kid wanted to ask him one favor. He bowed and asked for Isa to take him to the whist court. At first he wondered for what purpose the Shizuki wanted to go there, but then he thought it was pretty good since he just wanted to go somewhere with wine. The guy agreed, but warned that it would be quite a long journey and they would go there on foot. But before doing so, the hero wanted Shizuki to ask permission from his grandmother or Kihei. Otherwise they would think he had kidnapped him. Shizuki thought that his grandmother wouldn't mind and decided to ask her. After thanking the hero, Shizuki ran off to get permission from his grandmother. Based on what he said, Kiyo would probably be against it, and Isa smiled involuntarily. Shizuki got the permission and Isa's soul was at peace. Finn was very attached to Shizuka and Mizuha and didn't mind going with them. The hero caught 2 birds that were to go to their breakfast, which impressed the children. Ace thought they both had a lot of fun, as the children were constantly chatting with each other along the way. The Vistacourt soldier made sure they had citizenship and welcomed them into the Vistacourt. The kids smiled and remembered that they all went through the gate together that day with Aaron and Martin Cross. Then he met that dwarf, and it had been 15 years since he had left this town. Wynn noticed how Isa lowered his head and became worried. The boy reached up to touch the elf's cheeks, but Isa told him not to worry. It was just nostalgia coming over him, and these were his tears of happiness. At that moment, Shizuki called out to Isa and asked him to look ahead. A little farther away, some people were shouting and calling for Isa. It was Roden, and the hero confessed to him that he was just remembering his first visit to the city. Roden smiled and said he never thought he would ever see it again, and was damn glad he did. The hero cautiously asked about a case, and the soldier smiled and said that after he was promoted, he stopped doing it. The aged Roden formally greeted Ace and those Vistacourt boys, then made the hero laugh. Later, Isa made his way to the house of Cleas and Martina. Wayne knocked on the door and they were opened by an elderly woman. Apparently she did not know the hero, and the guy introduced himself. He wanted to know if the Cleas or Martina were home, as he wanted to collect the keys to his house. The woman did not quite understand him, but said she would find out from the owner now. A woman came out towards them with a bundle on her head, which turned out to be a Martina. She was glad that the hero had returned, and the guy admitted that she had become quite a statuesque lady. The girl said with a smile that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and he would probably like a key to his house. But she warned that it was probably dirty and he needed to at least tidy up the bedroom. Martina wanted the boys to stay for a short time, besides Cleas was due back soon. Martina noticed the kids behind the hero and was surprised. Surely she hadn't heard the news from Aaron yet. The boy introduced the baby Win to her. The other was the Shizuki he was looking after in the capital. Cleas returned almost as soon as they arrived. But his greatest surprise was not when he saw the hero or the wines, but when he looked at the Shizuki. Perhaps it was the fact that Cleas was the father of the Shizuki and Mizuki. But the hero didn't understand how that happened. Sure, they did know each other, but even then he had a family. And it was more like friendship than love. Besides, the hero didn't think that Kiyo was the kind of person who would destroy someone else's family. Of course, he would have liked to ask Kiyo who the father of her children was, but somehow that question got sidetracked. Perhaps Shizuki knew who his father was and had traveled here on purpose, but it was unclear to the hero why the Kia had let him go. The questions came rushing in one after another, but Isa sighed heavily and decided he didn't care. After all, no matter who Wine's parents were, he wouldn't dislike him. That's why both Kia and her mom loved Mizuha and Shizuki without a doubt. Toward evening, all three returned to Isa's house and went to bed. The boy felt that he didn't need to know everything, as he would always be on the side of the children. He smiled and said good night to them. The next day at breakfast, Kihai's son Shizuki suddenly decided to challenge the best swordsman of Rudria, Lord Cleas, the Holy Sword. You could tell from Isa's incomprehensible look that he didn't know his nickname called Holy Sword. Cleas frowned and placed the cup of tea on the table. He didn't mind fighting him with wooden swords after the meal. It suddenly became clear to the hero why Shizuki wanted to come here. In a moment of tense and fast fight, Cleas planted the momentum and punched Shizuki in the stomach. Every time the guy got hit, he asked to fight him again. Cleas had become a master swordsman because of his technique, not his strength, and he was now in his early 40s or so. At the moment of their fight, Vin asked Shizuki not to give up and cheered for him. It was no exaggeration to say that Shizuki was growing up to be a genius, partly due to his surroundings and partly due to his own skills. But for a Cleas, Holy Sword, he was clearly no match. The man again knocked the boy's sword out of his hands with ease and set another victory behind him. With each defeat, Shizuki was getting angrier. He shouted that there was more to come and asked to attack. Shizuki may not have realized that Cleas wanted to connect with his father, albeit through the sword. But it was unclear how the adults felt about it and what they thought about it. No one knew how they might have reacted. It seemed to the hero that everyone except Shizuka was up to no mischief. He had no need to worry then, and decided to let it be. After all, bound by the thread of fate, they would meet someday anyway. And if one looked at their fight from the outside, they were bound to meet sooner or later. Cleas looked fearfully at Shizuki, whose nose was bleeding. He apologized and thought he had hit him hard. But Shizuki did not give up and tried to defeat him in some way. Therefore, the hero saw him as striving to become stronger. Perhaps he just needed it. Shizuki wiped his nose and asked to fight again. After visiting the city, about a month passed and Shizuki's sister was outraged that only her brother went. She thought it was unfair. When they went back, the hero was attacked by the outraged Mizuha. The hero decided that next time he would have to go somewhere with her. Meanwhile, Shizuki presented his parents with souvenirs, for which they thanked him. Kihai's mother noticed that the place was rather noisy, but Mizuki was a girl after all. One could understand if they were away for a couple days, but not a month. Isa decided that he would make them a sword to apologize. He said that this sword was forged under pressure from the Mizuki girl to earn her forgiveness. Today they were walking in the forest near the capital and the children could have fun. There were far fewer strong monsters here now, so it was safe to walk around. Erna thought that they had all worked hard together for a good time. While the children were playing, Mizuki noticed a strange cave and asked Isa about it. The hero smiled and said that it was the lair of a snake monster and it was just huge, so it was better not to touch it. Mizuki clarified that there was a monster there, but Isa wasn't going to defeat it. Isa replied that he didn't like to kill just for fun, even if it was a monster, in which case they would have to eat it for lunch. The children were surprised and did not know that snakes could be eaten. Besides, they are not here to kill monsters and Mizuki suggested that they should go further. Both Shizuki and Mizuki were children of the head of the dojo. They were well-mannered and not selfish, but they are still young children. Although they had loving mother and grandmother, but still they lacked their father's love. So Shizuki challenged Clayes in an attempt to overpower him. And Mizuha was a girl, so she threw a tantrum upon their return. The hero thought they were both cute and innocent. Mizuha noticed that Isa had stopped and called out to him. They headed further into the forest where they came across a huge tree. It reached unimaginable sizes, which amazed the children. It was a spirit tree that would not appear unless they had someone with them who could see spirits. Isa decided to show them this tree. Without the hero, neither Mizuha nor Win would be able to find it since it was very important to the elves. The boy smiled as he noticed that it had grown even stronger and must have had a lot of fruit on it. Win noticed something and showed it to Isa. He was pointing to a flower that was blooming out of season. Isa smiled and said that apparently the spirit tree was very happy to see them. He then suggested that the children look for a snack, and both readily agreed. Their menu today included fried mushrooms and rabbit on the fire. Mizuhi thanked Eyes for hanging out with her today and said she had a lot of fun. Her eyes were burning and she wondered if she would make a good adventurer. The hero had no idea, but would understand better if she ate a snake, and the girl frowned. She got angry when Win along with Eyes laughed at her and pulled the wind by her cheeks. Mizuha was still less than 10 years old and she would still have the chance to choose her path. The hero couldn't stop his laughter and apologized to the girl. Mizuha wanted to become an adventurer and perhaps he should have prepared weapons and armor for her like he had done before. The hero's time in the dojo dragged on. The boys measured the growth of Win, who wanted to grow faster, and complained to Isu. They practiced together and they all had dinner together every night. Thus, 8 years had passed since they came to this dojo. One day, a frustrated Mizuha and Shizuki came to the hero and Isu thought they had chipped the blade again, but was mistaken. The thing is, his grandmother was calling him, and Isa asked Winna to fill in for him. Vin thought sadly of her flame dying out and said he would take care of everything here. The hero thanked him and passed for Mizuha and Shizuka. In all these 8 years, the twins had each turned 15, and he gave them each a sword. But the wine was still far behind them. It wasn't surprising that he noticed how he was growing up quite differently than the other children. There was nothing he could do about it, and eventually he became estranged from them. Nevertheless, the hero was very grateful to the twins for spending tons of time with him. But then the problems of his age started and Win asked the hero to get away from him. But the hero didn't regret it. He was glad to be back in the dojo, and with these thoughts he asked for permission to enter the room. Kihai's mother had not been well lately, and perhaps it was due to her age and poor health. The boy said that he had come here at her request to talk to him. It was evident that she had a little time left and would soon die. The woman smiled and said she would like to talk to him. She would also like to apologize to him. When her husband died, she thought that she too would die soon and leave the Kiha alone. But at that moment they had Isa. There were only 2 women in the house, so she was wary of him at first. But he quickly became part of their lives. He not only cured her illness and ended their feud with the Lordran, but also rebuilt their dojo. Thanks to him, her daughter grew up to be a fine swordsman, and he asked for nothing in return. The hero was content with his position as an apprentice. The hero became a guiding light for them on their path. The hero didn't think it was true, but the woman asked him to believe her, for she wasn't exaggerating. The fact was that when he left, he cursed her daughter, but she was sure he had not done it on purpose. She had children, raised them, recruited students, and defended the dojo. She also honed her skills as a swordsman, and it was quite difficult for her. After all, she was doing all of this so that one day he could return here. She wanted to have children, so she made a very unusual request to the famous swordsman and his wife. Eventually, the hero realized how things had happened in the past. Isa didn't know what to think now and didn't understand why they just didn't turn her down. As for Aaron, she left Cleese because of the difference in life expectancy, and perhaps because of that Martin couldn't refuse them. The woman also did not know the reason, and perhaps it was all because they too had not been able to refuse her daughter. But perhaps they were just afraid to refuse her, and they ended up granting her daughter's wish. But the hero didn't realize what curse he might have put on her, and the woman smiled in response. The fact was that Kia was in love with him. It was a love that even with time never fades. She wanted to pass on her sword to her children for one purpose, so that he could return here, and he would be welcome here. The woman was sure the Kia would not want him to know all of this, but her mother did not want to take this secret with her to the grave. Until that moment she had been terribly angry and resentful of him, but now she was calmer. She loved these children like a true mother, and her grandchildren grew up to be decent people. In addition, the hero came back again, making her smile. The woman took the boy's hand. She did not tell him to spend the rest of her time with the Kiha. It was enough for him to just keep her love in mind. The hero promised her, and after this conversation, 5 days later she left this world. Days spent grieving for loved ones who have passed away will not change anything, and everything will be a thing of the past. 2 years later, Aswald received a letter from a dwarf. Ace's teacher wrote that he needed a savvy assistant, and if there was time asked him to come. It was not surprising that he noticed him. For the past few years, the hero had always taken first place in sword forging competitions. Not that he became the best at it, it was just that the dwarf who had taken first place before had returned to his homeland. The reason for this was the election of a new dwarven king. In their country, blacksmithing skills are directly related to his social status. This time there was a serious competition looming. Perhaps Isa was too egotistical, but he wanted to believe that this dwarf would try to fulfill the promise he had made to him. All in order to build a country where elves could play. The hero told Win that he would go to the gnome country and ask the guy what he would do. Isa would have wanted him to stay, but Vin said he was going with him. He thought for sure Isa would probably pull some nonsense without him. The boy felt bad that Vin was taking him for a fool and signed up to be his babysitter, but Vin firmly said he would go and the hero had to agree with him. The elves and dwarves got along well in principle, and perhaps Vin would find a friend there. In that case, the hero decided to teach him how to communicate with the dwarves, and a long conversation awaited them. After 3 months, Isa talked to Kia and warned that they would be leaving tomorrow. The girl smiled sadly and assumed that they were saying goodbye forever this time, but the hero promised to return. The hero knew that time flowed differently for him, but in her last moments he wished he could be by her side. And it took him a while to realize many things. Isa wanted to be by her side, and that was his response to her feelings. The boy believed that death was not necessarily the end of everything, for he was reborn here. He had already lived as a high elf for a long time, and it was quite possible that she was here somewhere too. Isa looked at the little spirit flying by with a smile and decided it was a small miracle. But the hero knew that when he saw the end of the Kiha, it would stay in his memory for a long time. The girl smiled and said that in that case it was his promise. She told the guy that she would look forward to seeing him in his last moments. The hero smiled and thought that the Kiha's face was now visibly burdened by age, but she was still beautiful. The hero reached his master through the snowy mountains. The dwarf was surprised that the elf followed him, for he thought that elves were weak creatures. The hero meant that he was practicing sports, but part of it was his training. He noticed that the spirits here also reacted to the wind. It was cooler in the mountains than in the forge, and the gnome was carrying all of Ace's belongings. The gnome smirked and noticed that they were lighter than iron ore after all. The gnome asked the lad to stay awake, for they had one mountain to go through. Normally, elves and humans were not allowed into the gnome's country. As an exception, those who had received permission to enter from a dwarven guide, or who had an advanced blacksmith license from a large country could enter. The hero had as many as 2 entrance permits. He asked the blacksmith guild to find a dwarven guide, and it was a bit of an elusive response. They chatted with him at the bar for a bit. His mentor was an amazing man, and to tell him how amazing he was, he had lived in Ludlow for a few years. Then he got a letter from him asking for help. The gnome interrupted the hero's story and said that he understood everything. He was still drinking, but he had already indulged in memories. The man offered just a drink and said that if the elves could walk the mountain path, he would take them with him. The guy warned the wine that he would be leaving in 3 days, and the wine felt nauseous from his stinking odor of alcohol. This was exactly how Isa had set off with his guide 2 weeks ago. The land of the dwarves was underground. In human terms, it was more like a city-state. According to their guide, tens of thousands of gnomes live here. At the entrance, the hero was stopped by gnome guards, but upon learning of his master, they immediately let him pass. Win and Isa were delighted with the gnome city. Win noticed that it was quite warm here, unlike the mountains. The gnome accompanying them said that Isekai'd's home was located here. Everyone around them was quite surprised to see the elves here. But suddenly someone stopped them and ordered them to stand still. One of the dwarves didn't understand who they were and how the elves dared to set foot on their land. The accompanying dwarf took off his hood. No one could believe that elves were here, and the attendant asked the dwarves to step back. The hero smiled at the thought of the dwarves being the best. Complaining openly and honestly from the front seemed much better to the guy than when people were whispering behind their backs. Isa slammed the wine on his head and told him to stay away. The hero walked out to the dwarf and introduced himself, saying he came to this country at the invitation of his teacher, and if they didn't like it, they could try to chase him away by force. Such a harsh statement made the dwarves confused, but then they shouted to the gnome Grander not to lose to him. The Grander noticed that Isa was too insolent and decided to show him his strength. Grander seemed to lose his temper, and clenched his fists in front of his face and sent Isa far away. If dwarves have hands from a radish, a normal elf would look like a burdock. But the hero's hands were as thick as carrots, and he punched the gnome in the face with his fist. The gnome fell to the ground, and the guy asked him what was wrong with him. He shouted that his teacher was even stronger and his fist could inflict a lot of pain. Isa motioned for the Grander to stand up and hesitated to see if he was definitely a dwarf. The boy beckoned the Grander with his hand, and the gnome asked him not to underestimate him. He yelled that this was just the beginning and pounced on the guy. Eventually, after their fight, the hero did confront his teacher. The dwarf confessed to the guy that he never ceased to surprise him. If they had called him at the entrance before immigrating into the country, they wouldn't have had any problems. And the hero probably realized this. The gnome applied a smelly compress to his student, which he didn't like, but it was effective. The teacher already knew what Isa wanted to do. Thanks to that fight, everyone realized that he had invited the elves to this land. There were now rumors going around the land that a strange elf had punched the Grander in the forehead. The hero became uncomfortable, at which point a woman came into their room and offered them tea. The guy noticed that his wife was young and reeked of criminality. Everyone laughed, and the dwarf ordered the boy not to play games with him. He knew they were trying to draw attention to the fact that he had invited the elves. He also knew they would try not to ruin his reputation this time of year, and he appreciated it. But the dwarf asked not to think that he was a pitiful man who could not take care of even one student. Isa realized what the matter was and asked for his forgiveness. Isekai'd was a proud man. Quite some time had passed, and the hero had forgotten how to ask someone for help. Isa apologized for stumping him, and the dwarf smiled at his apprentice. He punched the boy in the stomach and said that however he did it well. And the elf who didn't lose to the dwarf miner had to be the first high elf in the world. Isekai'd smiled and admitted that he was proud to be his friend. He patted the elf on the shoulder, who yelled that he was hurt but was glad to meet his teacher. As they were talking, they heard Wine shouting outside the door and decided to sneak a peek. Vin yelled at the dwarves that he wasn't a girl, but they didn't believe him. A young boy told Vin that he did not have a beard. While the children were arguing, the hero realized that Isekai'd already had 4 children. He didn't know that gnome children could grow beards either. Isekai'd said he was 20 years old and about 10 years old by human standards. The hero never would have thought that the first Win fight would turn out to be so fascinating. Apparently, his teacher had raised his children without prejudice against elves. The hero was proud to tears that Win had become quite bold, somewhat stubborn, and brave. Isekai'd called out to his apprentice and offered to cut to the chase. He decided to briefly outline the details of the Isu. There were a number of masters who competed with their masters, but there is one dwarf who now stands at the head of them all, and his name is Roger. The same Roger who trained Koshman, his apprentice, the sorcerer and blacksmith. However, Roger's skill as a blacksmith is not enough to be called a master craftsman. But the hero did not understand what the dwarf meant. The point was that Roger had reworked the mithril. It was a rare metal that the dwarves valued most and was the symbol of the king. The processing required a tremendous amount of heat, and there is only one furnace in this land designed for this purpose. This furnace is a hidden treasure that could only be handled by becoming king. It was believed that the furnace received its heat from a true flame deep in the earth. Elven mythology said it was heated by dwarves. Guy wondered if they would return afterward. Roger collected dwarves with experience in magic as apprentices and created magical tools. He used them to process mithril without using hidden treasures. It became clear to the hero and after that the old-fashioned dwarves rebelled. And if Roger gets the throne, it could lead to the country favoring those with a talent for magic. Magic tools are handy, but one had to have a talent for magic to use them. Dwarves who were only skilled in blacksmithing were beginning to show impatience, and now they were all trying to work with mithril. The hero looked at the teacher in surprise and thought that he was on the side of the old dwarves. But Oswald admitted that it was certainly an interesting technology. But this time he would like to win the throne and there was a reason he couldn't give up. He wanted to create a country where elves could come and play to them. Oswald wanted to show it to all the dwarves. In this country, no one knew what would happen when the dwarves and elves joined forces, and the dwarf wondered how many friends he had among his students. The hero was sorry that the cowgirl was not there for him. By the way, he thought the dwarf had some idea of what kind of magical instrument Roger had created. Surely the Koshman would be fighting Ace, watching the confrontation between the masters and thinking that his teacher would win.